Imagine a world where your skills and connections determine your worth as a person, where having the right abilities and surrounding yourself with powerful people dictate how successful you will be in the future. The protagonist of our story lives in such a world and firmly believes in this idea. However, since he is not among the elite of society, he sees this as the reason for his professional failure. On top of struggling to find a job, his mother is hospitalized due to an accident. To make matters worse, not only does he have to cover the treatment costs, but an ex-friend also used his information to take on a massive debt in his name. His father, devastated by his mother's condition, has drowned himself in alcoholism and depression, sometimes becoming extremely aggressive. The protagonist is willing to do anything to change his life. Little does he know that his wish will come true in the worst way possible. Our story begins in the midst of a bloody battle. The protagonist finds himself lost when a fireball crashes right in front of him. He questions what he should do when one of the warriors calls out his name, asking if he has a death wish. The boy is confused, seemingly unaware of where he is. The warrior approaches and shakes him, telling him to keep his head straight unless he wants to die in the battle. Still dazed, he apologizes. Looking around, he struggles to understand what is happening. After all, he thought he had simply clicked on a job advertisement. Back to reality. He is in his home. His living room is a complete mess, resembling a crime scene, as he puts it. He heads toward his father's room and greets him. His father, watching TV in a somber mood, welcomes him back and tells him to wash his face before having dinner. However, the boy assumes he'll have to clean up the house first. He reflects on how it was nice being out of the house for a while, but he wonders if things have gone too far. All because the neighbor's son earns $4 million a month. He recalls that his father had never been so angry before, but a woman corrects him, saying he had indeed been this angry before. She tries to remind him of a certain incident, but the protagonist is startled. He hadn't noticed her there. He asks why she is hiding in the corner. She tells him that Minsu and his father came over, and she knows this because of the door next to hers. The protagonist asks what Minsu did and if he at least left a number, but she tells him to drop it and not make things worse. She then starts cleaning up while the protagonist heads to his room. She warns him not to go after Minsu, as they don't have the money to pay his bail. The protagonist replies that he's not the kind of person to do that. He just wants to find more places to apply for jobs, that he thinks that if it weren't for Minsu, his family wouldn't be living like this. But he quickly shakes the thought away, wanting to focus on something more valuable. That he uses his computer to search for websites offering thousands of dollars for university students. He notes that some high school students working as CAD operators make $12,000 a month, while he is just a broke graduate who can't even make that much. Frustrated, he says he would even sell his soul if it meant finding a job. Most of the available jobs are factory work or labor-intensive, and today is no better than yesterday. Afterward, he checks his phone for missed calls and notices a website offering free discount coupons. He suspects it might be spam, but the site claims to provide job-seeking advice. He figures taking a look wouldn't hurt. However, instead of useful information, he only finds a single message asking if he wants a job. Suspicious, he wonders what's wrong with the site. A new message appears, stating that it could cost whatever he desires. A registration box pops up. He accepts. The first question asks if he has a hobby that takes up more than 20 hours a week, including gaming. He answers yes. The next question, if he suddenly received a large sum of money, how would he spend it? He thinks for a moment and decides he would probably start a business, investing every cent into it. The next question asks what he considers the most important thing in life. He answers, family. The protagonist finds this process amusing. He has never really taken time to analyze himself like this. The final question states, without thinking about others, just comparing yourself to yourself, do you believe you are a person of value? He contemplates deeply before answering. Once he completes the form, the site processes his request. It was just a few questions, but he already feels a little better. The site then displays, loading simulation tutorial. A bright light engulfs him. Suddenly, he is teleported to an unknown place. The protagonist questions if he is dreaming. He doesn't remember falling asleep, only that he was searching for jobs online. He hears someone calling him Parson and feels as if he is seeing someone else's memories. In Parson's memories, he sees his family, his bedridden mother, his younger sibling, and his not-so-great father, who has lived his life without much care for anything. The protagonist wonders what kind of bizarre dream this is. However, Amidst the battle, someone shouts at Parson, telling him to snap out of it and fight, or he will be killed. It is then that he realizes. At this moment, he is no longer Choi Kong, but Parson. With that in mind, he decides to act accordingly. The only explanation is that he is experiencing some sort of dream, so he convinces himself to stay alive. He's certain he'll wake up at some point. The battle is intense and bloody. The warriors in his army struggle to push forward with their shields. The protagonist notices a siege tower ahead. A warrior calls him a rookie, immediately recognizing that it's his first time in this battlefield. According to Parsons' memories, this man is a sergeant major in the mercenary corps. The sergeant tells him that once the ladder is ready, he should stop overthinking and climb, never allowing fear to stop him from moving forward. Their mission is to use the siege tower to scale the fortress walls, infiltrate the stronghold, and open the gates from the inside. Once the gates are open, the knights will follow. Until then, the mercenaries must survive at all costs. The sergeant orders everyone to advance, motivating them to keep moving if they want to live. His men seem confident in their victory. The leader commands them to push forward. Retreat is not an option, as the moment they fall back, they'll be shot down by a rain of arrows with the siege tower in place. He orders the men to climb. The protagonist feels like he is inside a war simulation or something similar. The moment he starts climbing the ladder, an arrow grazes his face. He feels pain, and it confuses him. Isn't this just a dream? Slowly, reality starts sinking in, and he begins to question what will happen if he dies here. As the mercenaries face off against the enemy archers, they charge forward under the relentless rain of arrows. Our hero refuses to be left behind. Armed with a spear, he fights his way through. He thinks, I can't die. Not in a place like this. Not when I can't even tell if this is real or not. With his spear, he strikes at an enemy. The enemy's armor gets scratched, and he grows furious. He immediately tries to strike back at the protagonist, but in Parsons' form, the boy charges at him first. With a quick movement, he manages to push the enemy off the wall. Due to the weight of his armor, the enemy falls and tumbles down the stairs, taking down anyone in his path. The protagonist feels relieved to have escaped, but realizes he needs another weapon. Spotting another spear on the ground, he grabs it and resumes his attack against the remaining enemies. His sheer ferocity intimidates them as he fights. He shouts, insulting his opponents. With the barrier broken, the mercenaries advance, surrounding the enemy forces. His sergeant praises his work. With the path cleared, the knights charge in, finally joining the battle. The entire war scene overwhelms the protagonist. The ground is littered with corpses from both sides. His adrenaline fades and relief washes over him. He has survived. At that moment, he understands that this is just as real as the arrow that struck him earlier. He needs time to regain his courage. Until then, he remains in character as Parsons. Upon entering the palace, the sergeant declares that everything inside now belongs to them. One of the local nobles warns that they will pay for this, but he is immediately cut down by one of the mercenaries. His lifeless body falls to the ground as they press forward into the palace. The sergeant acknowledges the difficulty of the invasion but declares that now is the time to feast on blood. By the end of the battle, 450 mercenaries and 131 regular soldiers remain. The victorious army's leader applauds his men, declaring it a total victory on this day. The glorious army of Aldous has freed these lands from the threat of the evil Dorian. He further states that this triumph was largely thanks to the brave mercenaries who fought at the front lines. Aldous, the leader, assures everyone that he will honor their agreement. One of the mercenaries remarks that they lost more than half their forces on this battlefield but supposes that it's still a victory for the people. For the protagonist, however, this was not a victory. To him, the entire experience felt like lambs being led to the slaughter. A superior officer orders them to form ranks. The protagonist is now completely immersed in his role. He falls in line but notices something strange. He appears to be the only one standing out. He wonders if the others don't know how to stand at attention. A memory surfaces. He recalls spending 24 exhausting months in the Korean military, enduring unnecessary beatings just to learn discipline. His posture was purely instinctual, yet Aldous immediately notices him among the soldiers. Being called out like this is the last thing he wanted. A sergeant orders Parsons to step forward and stand in the center. He obeys instantly. Aldous states that he heard this was his first battle, yet he accomplished great feats. However, in the protagonist's mind, his conclusion is entirely different. He believes that nobles simply use exceptional soldiers as disposable tools, discarding the unwanted ones so that only a few survive. Aldous announces that there is an open position among his squires and asks if Parsons is interested. The protagonist doesn't know how to respond. All he can think is that this is no. Different from being a personal servant, so he answers, "That position is far too prestigious for a peasant like me. I am nothing more than a humble farmer. Giving me such an honor would be like throwing pearls before swine. Neither of us would benefit from this decision, and it would only lead to regret." Aldous, however, smiles. He comments that the boy has good manners and that leaving him among the mercenaries would be a waste. The protagonist realizes that being polite may have been a mistake. He quickly changes his approach and asks for a silver pouch instead of a title. Aldous' smile fades, annoyed. He remarks that asking for money is typical of a mercenary. Aldous then dismisses him, ordering him to stay out of his sight from now on. The protagonist understands that the Lord is furious. By asking for money, he essentially spat on Aldous' gracious offer. He just hopes that nothing bad will come from this. As he leaves, the mercenaries laugh and say he's got guts. They remark that his priorities are clear. The protagonist knows that a squire outranks a sergeant, but he also knows something else. None of this matters to the soldiers to owe him. This is better than being cut down by an enraged sergeant seeking revenge for being outshined. The next day, a new lineup forms. It's payday. The person in charge warns everyone not to leave before receiving their wages. When Parsons' turn comes, he receives 108 gold coins for his service. As he takes the pouch, he asks himself, "Is this real money?" Memories of the war flash through his mind. The countless dead bodies he had seen. He realizes that this money was earned through killing, and suddenly, he doesn't know how to feel about it. Will he continue living here as Parsons? However, before he can answer that question, a system alert appears. Simulation tutorial has ended. Penalties will now be converted into rewards. Immediately after, the transportation sequence to the original dimension begins. The protagonist is instantly transported back to his room. He sits there, stunned. What was that? He begins questioning whether it was all just a dream. Or maybe an illusion that turned him into a 16-year-old boy in the Middle Ages. His memories felt incredibly real. As he looked to the side, he noticed a strange object on the floor. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a gold coin. Meanwhile, his computer screen still displayed the website's message, stating that for those willing to sell their souls, there was a job, something relentless and capable of pushing them to their full potential. The protagonist checked his wallet and then looked at the money in his hand, standing outside a store that specialized in buying gold. Considering everything, he hadn't expected to get much for the coin, but they paid him about 70,000 Korean wons for it. Earlier, he had been in a world where reality and fiction were indistinguishable. But thanks to this gold coin, he had just made real money. However, if the coin was real, then it meant everything he experienced was real too. The stabbing, the slashing, the killing, the screams he had heard were not mere illusions. As he trembled, shaken by the realization, his phone rang, startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He wondered who could be calling him at this hour. Looking at the screen, he saw the name Sui. He immediately recognized it as the name of the job recruitment website. He debated whether to answer, but curiosity wouldn't let him ignore it. A voice on the other end greeted him politely, addressing him as Mr. Kang, and asked if he was doing well. Confused, he tried to figure out who was speaking and how they knew his name. The voice explained that they had his registration on the site and wanted to know if he was available to start today. Suspicious, he hesitated. But the voice continued, explaining that there had been an informational session for members, and they would appreciate his presence. They then asked if, after everything he had been through, he wouldn't want to learn more about his experience. His curiosity was piqued. Despite his doubts, Choi Kong decided to visit the location given to him. Inside the elevator, uncertainty gnawed at him. He felt as if he were about to make a deal with the devil. Even so, he needed to understand what had happened. He focused as the elevator doors opened. A secretary stood before him, welcoming him to the workshop. He asked if this was the Sui office, and she confirmed, offering to escort him to a dining room if he wished. He quickly realized that her voice matched the one on the phone. Trying to act natural, he casually remarked that she was much prettier than he expected. She asked what exactly he had been expecting. He had certain assumptions about her, expecting something more demonic, maybe even a succubus. However, she confidently stated that she would never dress like that. It wasn't her style. Feeling embarrassed, Choi Kang suddenly realized that he hadn't actually spoken his thoughts out loud. Yet, she had responded as if she had heard them. She simply looked at him with an amused expression before pointing to a door, informing him that her president was waiting inside to explain everything. Just before he entered, she shared one more piece of information. She told him that the gold coin he had received was actually worth around 4 million Korean wons. The amount he was paid was because the coin had been severely undervalued. Shocked, the protagonist wondered how she knew exactly how much he had been paid for the coin. She responded effortlessly, explaining that if they could send people to different dimensions, tracking his location and actions was nothing in comparison. Stunned, Choi Kang was still processing the revelation when she urged him to go inside. Even as confusion clouded his thoughts, he entered and found himself face to face with the CEO of the company. The woman looked at him and politely asked him to take a seat, saying she had been expecting him. Choi Kang observed her. Compared to a CEO of a major corporation, she looked more like a celebrity. She seemed pleased by the thought, almost as if she had read his mind. Introducing herself as Woo Sinri, the administrator and CEO of the company, she greeted him formally. The protagonist, keeping his composure, responded politely, acknowledging that it was an honor to meet her. However, he wasted no time and asked if he had really sold his soul in some kind of contract. She confirmed that he wasn't wrong. With that, Choi Kang came to the only possible conclusion. Everything he had experienced was real. Woo Sinri clarified that what he had completed was only the tutorial. She further explained that he was now level 1 and that this was all the information she could provide at the moment. However, she assured him that he could use the experience he gained for future jobs. Still confused, Choi Kang pressed further. He wanted to know exactly what she meant. Was he chosen at random? Or was there a specific reason for selecting him? Woo Sinri asked if they looked like the type of company that granted opportunities to random individuals. She revealed that they knew everything about him. She knew that his best friend had stolen his identity, racking up a massive debt in his name. She knew that his mother had suffered a terrible accident and had been in a coma ever since. She even knew that, on top of his own debt, he was now responsible for all of his mother's medical expenses. Then, she asked if her information was correct. The protagonist, now completely unsettled, demanded to know what she really wanted from him. Woo Sinri hesitated before answering. Meanwhile, Choi Kang's thoughts raced. He realized that they had used his family to get to him. Sensing his unease, she reassured him that for now, he was free to do as he pleased and that they had no intention of harming his family. Still, he asked again. What did she want from him? This time, Woo Sinri answered directly. For now, he was needed for his current level. Choi Kang understood what she meant. They wanted him to return to the fantasy world. And she confirmed it. Yes, they did. He thought about the words tutorial and levels. Everything about this felt like a game. The woman confirmed that this was the best way to think about it. After all, they didn't want him to break down from the guilt of having blood on his hands. Choi Kang realized that in this other dimension, he received missions, and if he succeeded, he earned rewards and leveled up. Woo Sinri confirmed that he was exactly right. He then asked if the contract was bound by specific rules. She nodded, confirming it. The protagonist questioned whether he only needed to follow orders and obey the rules, despite not even knowing who he had agreed to work for. He didn't understand their motives or who they really were, making it impossible to trust them. To him, that was completely irrational. The woman responded that perhaps he was right, but the real question was something else entirely. She also noted that he had a way with words. She explained that some ambiguities were left in place for his own protection. Not to deceive him, Woo Sinri compared the situation to giving a child a sex education lesson by making them watch explicit content. It simply wouldn't make sense. She mentioned concepts such as avatar possession, parallel universes, diverging realities, and people moving between dimensions to fulfill clients' missions. She then asked if any of that made sense to him. All he could think about was the young mercenary Parsons and his level F request, the lowest classification for a client's mission. Just by surviving in that territory, he had barely met the minimum requirements to complete the mission. Woo Sinri pointed out that despite that, he had participated in the raid on the castle, qualifying for additional compensation. Furthermore, he had gained recognition from 2 of the highest-ranked individuals, which entitled him to a bonus reward. She was certain that people would be grateful to have signed a contract with her. For the protagonist, however, this was hard to accept, that he couldn't help but believe that she wasn't lying. If everything she said was true, then did that mean he seemed real to the people in those other dimensions? The woman observed him and commented that, compared to his previous insolence, he seemed to have a delicate mindset. It made sense. After all, it was that same mentality that led him to sign the contract in the first place. Possibly, the most gratifying thing about all of this was receiving the rewards from a successful mission. Each gold coin was worth 1,600,000 Korean wons. Depending on the client, the payment for missions could differ greatly. Becoming a millionaire overnight was always possible with this job. The protagonist then asked if there were penalties for failure, what would happen if he failed a mission or died. The woman explained that if his character died, then his character would be permanently dead. However, he himself would remain alive in the real world. Kang felt relieved at first, but the woman warned him that they would appreciate it if he didn't exploit this loophole as a free pass to do whatever he wanted in the fictional world. She pointed out that even he wouldn't like it if someone messed up his life without permission. He admitted that her logic made sense. She also explained that the biggest downside to failing a mission was that he would lose a level. The protagonist asked if that was all he would lose. Instead of answering, she asked him about the Parsons tutorial he had completed. What was the percentage chance of receiving a reward? He answered, 1%. The woman then asked, what if it were 100%? If that were the case, he would have earned 100 million won. Woo Sinri explained that high risk came with high reward. She asked if he understood that the reward amount was proportional to the client's level and that those with higher levels would do everything in their power to protect their standing. The protagonist could only think about earning 100 million won. That if his level had been higher, he could have earned even more. That possibility excited him. However, he suddenly paused, thinking deeply. Kang had a moment of clarity. He had killed people for money. The realization hit him hard, filling him with guilt. Woo Sinri told him that hating himself wouldn't change anything. She explained that at the end of the day, it was thanks to him that others could survive and return safely home. The protagonist felt conflicted by her words. She continued, stating that in a world where money dictates everything, making money equals survival to some extent, he could almost consider it a basic instinct, a new way of life that had just been offered to him. If he was interested. She then told him that he was free to leave and that they wouldn't force him into anything. The protagonist thought about it for a moment before asking what he should do next. Woo Sinri simply smiled and told him that he would have to figure it out himself. Shortly after, the protagonist was transported once again to a parallel reality. As soon as he arrived, he felt dizzy. He wondered if he had done something wrong. When he opened his eyes, he found himself wearing armor. Right in front of him, an enemy was about to attack. A battle axe swung straight toward him. Fear rushed through his body, and he let out a terrified scream. The axe, however, slammed into the wall instead of hitting him. He felt a mix of fear and embarrassment. The man who had attacked him smiled, leaving the protagonist even more confused. He questioned what had just happened and what kind of mess he had gotten himself into. The man warned him to be more cautious. He had triggered a trap. Realizing the man had actually saved him, Kang felt embarrassed. The axe had protected him from an arrow that nearly hit him. Seeing this, he felt a wave of shame. The man informed him that the arrow was likely poisoned, considering the kind of labyrinth they were in. The protagonist snapped back to reality. Not only that, but he realized that he was part of a 4-person team. The setting was Sandpak, and the leader of the group was the man with the battle axe. His team joked that he had also triggered a trap. A rock tied to a rope swung down and hit him. The protagonist sarcastically questioned how someone like him could be a guild leader when he made such rookie mistakes. At that moment, his memory returned. These people were helping him find something. He was there to find someone, but the details were hazy until a system screen appeared before him. It stated that he was now playing as Yuval Pion, a 24-year-old character. His mission was to explore the labyrinth and find the son of Halig Leopold. The protagonist recognized it as a status window and recalled his earlier conversation with Woo Sinri about whether this was a game or not. She had explained that when he entered another dimension, he would be acting in place of the client, but his appearance would remain the same. Those around him, he would appear to be the person they knew. His life, his reputation, and his existence all became part of that world. But if this was like last time, he might have to kill someone again. In such a situation, he questioned what to do. Had he rushed into this too quickly? Maybe he should have thought more carefully before signing that contract. He quickly thought about his family and reflected on his situation. His companions asked what was on his mind and whether he was getting cold feet due to lack of sleep. However, he pushed those thoughts aside. He would do whatever it took. He reassured them that he was fine. Everyone was feeling overwhelmed with information, but one thing was certain. He had to complete the mission and return, no matter what. Yuval Pion was the youngest son of a knightly household. Since birth, He had worked tirelessly to become a knight like his father. However, after his mother was run over by a noble's carriage, his life had only gotten worse. Her death traumatized him, changing him forever. His father fell into grief and alcoholism, and his fragile younger sister was too weak to offer any help. With no other choice, the burden of responsibility fell on his shoulders to survive. He had to enlist in the war through effort and sheer luck. He achieved numerous victories, but without the right connections, all his achievements were stolen by others. Gold coins like these were never enough to save him from this life, let alone his home or his family. Yuval Pion felt completely defeated at that moment. In his despair, a single ray of hope appeared. A lord summoned him and told him that his son had gone missing. Desperate for adventure, the child had run off into the labyrinth and ventured too far. The lord then asked Yuval Pion if he had the ability to become a true knight and bring his son back. Yuval's order of knights followed Count Halig, who personally assigned him this mission. Yuval, this was his chance. If he succeeded, he would gain powerful connections on his own merit. For the first time, hope ignited within him. Hope, that was the most important thing to him. The protagonist was now living the life of Yuval Pion. When he tried to close his eyes to sleep, he found it impossible. He was trapped reliving these memories. Every time he closed his eyes, Yuval's past played over and over again in his mind. He realized that the only way to free himself from these memories was to complete the mission. The protagonist understood the information and wanted the memories to stop. He thought to himself that living inside a client's mind was the worst. A system notification appeared, informing him that Yuval's defining trait was chronic insomnia. Unable to sleep, the protagonist felt exhausted. As he thought about it, he realized something strange. This situation felt familiar. It was just like Parsons' case. A sick mother, a father who turned to alcohol, and a younger sister. But the most important part was that the son was willing to do anything. Could this really be a coincidence? It was as if the company was deliberately giving him cases that mirrored his own life. He recalled what Wu Xinri had said, that whenever possible, they would make him treat these worlds as his own, as if these people were his real family and friends. It was as if they had selected these cases on purpose, to make him act carefully. The thought confused him deeply. Before he could think any further, he heard a strange sound, the clash of metal. A fight was happening nearby. He quickly got up from the ground, scanning his surroundings. Looking at his companions, he realized that Pissel was missing. That could only mean he was the one fighting. He immediately shouted for everyone to get up. Not far away, a battle was indeed taking place. A goblin was attacking Pissel, who was desperately trying to defend himself with a spear. However, the goblin wasn't alone. More of them were rushing toward the boy. Despite his exhaustion, Pissel managed to fend off several enemies, but the fight had drained him. He was too tired to run. Just as he stopped to catch his breath, a massive warg appeared. The beast's sheer size made it clear Pissel wouldn't escape this time. The creature lunged at him. Furious, Pissel, terrified, screamed for help. That moment, the protagonist arrived just in time. With his sword in hand, he struck down the goblin. After defeating the monster, the protagonist approached Pissel and asked if he was okay. Still shaken, the boy nodded. The rest of the group sighed in relief. Pissel was safe. The team leader scolded him, saying this was what happened when you wandered around instead of sleeping. But he quickly noticed something else. More goblins were approaching. He asked if Pissel had attracted their attention. Pissel nervously admitted that it was an accident. Frustrated, the leader insisted that he wanted to hear every detail of this accident. The protagonist, however, urged them to save the conversation for later. The leader agreed, but said they would do things his way without wasting time. The group prepared to eliminate all the goblins at once. The creatures gathered in large numbers, but the protagonist didn't back down. Together, they launched a fierce counterattack. The goblins were relentless, but the team fought back with equal intensity as they slaughtered the creatures. The protagonist began analyzing the situation. Based on Yuval's memories, they had been inside the labyrinth for 4 days. However, this was the first time they had encountered so many monsters at once. That explained why everyone was on edge. It made sense. These people were trained for duels and wars, not for monster hunting. The only reason this group had even entered the labyrinth was because Yuval had requested their help. At the time, their leader had agreed immediately, saying that Yuval had once saved his life, that he had sworn to repay that debt. Back in the battle, the protagonist continued cutting down goblins. However, he soon realized that he had strayed too far from the others. An idea came to mind. He called out to Tsidon, the archer, telling him he had a plan. Sidon hesitated, not understanding why. The protagonist insisted, telling him to find a higher position. Now catching on, Sidon realized that the plan could actually work. That he rushed toward the protagonist, who was ready to give him a boost. With a powerful push, the protagonist launched him upward. From this new vantage point, Sidon had a clear view of the battlefield. With perfect positioning, he could now rain arrows down on the enemy with precision. The protagonist smirked that he had just turned Sidon into the mercenary's trump card. With a clear advantage on the battlefield, Sidon had a privileged view of the enemies. Now, his value in the fight was equivalent to that of 10 men. Meanwhile, the group leader found himself surrounded. He shouted at the goblins to back off, but it was useless. The enemies were attacking him from all sides. Seeing this, the protagonist grew worried. The leader was desperate for help, calling out for assistance as goblins closed in on him. However, the protagonist shouted back, telling him to just push through them instead of focusing on each individual enemy. The key was to eliminate them all. He quickly called Rob and Pissel, instructing them to assist Sanit and finish off the remaining goblins. Sanit, who was almost being torn apart, was panicking, but following the protagonist's advice, he decided to counterattack. Like a rampaging tank, he plowed through the goblins, killing several at once. The rest of the group followed suit, including the protagonist, who never stopped fighting. After a long battle, they finally managed to eliminate all the goblins. The protagonist looked around, seeing the bodies of goblins everywhere at last. It was over. Now, they could finally have some peace and quiet. Cater turned to Sanit, teasing him about acting like their leader and giving out orders. Sanit, bruised and beaten, insisted that Yuval was the real leader. He had saved him once, making him worthy of command. Pissel told the leader that the archer was just messing around. The protagonist observed Sanit closely and felt a wave of concern. Sanit, confused, asked why the protagonist suddenly looked so serious. The protagonist pointed out that he was pale as a ghost and sweating excessively. Sanit brushed it off, claiming he was fine, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't even stand. Pissel, concerned, rushed to help him stay upright. The protagonist immediately took charge, ordering the others to lay Sanit down and check his body for any wounds. It was possible that he had been poisoned during the battle. At that moment, a system notification appeared. The protagonist was startled by the alert. It was a subquest. The objective of the subquest was simple: ensure the survival of all team members. Completing it successfully would grant him a 10% bonus on his mission payment. Now, he had another problem to deal with. Not only did he have to worry about the monsters, but he also had to protect his teammates. Still, at least there was a reward involved. He quickly ordered Rob to gather supplies and said he would check for any medical items they had. Sidon soon found the wound. It was on Sanit's abdomen and looked severe. It had been caused by a poisoned arrow. The wound was nasty. Sidon leaned in closer, examining the injury. The protagonist, alarmed, immediately asked what he was doing. Sidon responded that he was going to suck out the venom. The protagonist stopped him immediately, warning him that doing so was dangerous. Even the smallest wound could easily infect someone else. Sidon quickly realized his mistake. The protagonist suggested another method to remove the venom. He told them to lower Sanit so that he could extract the poison manually. Placing his hands on Sanit's abdomen, he applied pressure to force the venom out. Sanit screamed in pain, writhing as the toxins were pushed out of his system. The others tried to calm him down, urging him not to struggle, as it would only make things worse. Rob returned with supplies, suggesting they use alcohol to disinfect the wound. However, the protagonist immediately stopped him, explaining that alcohol could actually spread the poison faster. Instead, he asked for a canteen of water, believing it would be more effective for cleaning the wound. Carefully, he washed the injury. Rob was surprised, mentioning that he had always used alcohol for treating wounds. Sidon also admitted that he now realized he had been doing it wrong all this time. The protagonist recalled everything he knew about first aid for poison wounds. Now, all that remained was to administer the antidote. He held the bottle in his hand, but something felt off. A sudden sense of dread washed over him. Looking at the bottle, he realized that he had been holding the antidote all along. Not watered, a memory surfaced. Yuval had once made the same mistake. In his haste, he had used the wrong medicine, which had accelerated the spread of the poison, killing his comrade. Sidon noticed his hesitation and asked why he wasn't giving Sanit the antidote yet. The protagonist decided to buy time and asked whether the antidote was for poison or intoxication. Neither of them knew. Sidon admitted that they had bought the cheapest antidote the pharmacist had offered. The protagonist thought carefully. Perhaps this was a useful memory from Yuval after all. Searching his bag, he found a rare medicinal herb known as absurherb.it contained antibacterial properties. And while not an instant cure, it was better than giving the wrong medicine. He prepared the herb. The others watched in silence, observing his careful actions. Once done, he told Sidon that Sanit was ready to be lifted. Sidon helped the injured leader get back up. The protagonist explained that they would bandage the wound, and Sanit needed to endure the pain for just a little longer. He worked quickly, wrapping the wound as tightly as possible. Now, all they could do was wait for him to recover. He reassured them that Sanit would be fine. Pissel agreed, saying that if Sanit had one good trait, it was his stubbornness. Sidon also nodded in agreement. Then, the protagonist turned to Pissel, calling his name. Pissel, startled, responded nervously. The protagonist told him that he wanted to hear an apology. He also demanded an explanation. Why had he led them into such a dangerous situation? The others were curious as well and asked what was so important that Pissel had to get up in the middle of the night. Pissel hesitated, looking nervous. Then he pulled out an item he had hidden away. A map. He showed it to them, pointing to their current location. The protagonist was shocked. Pissel had a dungeon map. Pissel explained that according to the map, if they walked straight ahead and turned left, there should be a set of stairs leading further down. That was supposed to be their next destination. However, Pissel revealed that the stairs didn't exist. He had searched the area multiple times and found nothing, and no matter how many times he looked, there was no staircase. That explained why they had felt like they were walking in circles. Pissel swore on his pride as a guide that he had done everything possible to locate the path. Unfortunately, while searching, he had accidentally triggered a trap, distracted by the map. He failed to notice that goblins had been watching him. By the time he realized it, he was completely surrounded. The others stared at him in silence. Then, without a word, they punished him. Pissel had to wait for them next time. His recklessness had nearly gotten them all killed. The protagonist examined the map and told Pissel that they would take another look. Before leaving, he entrusted the camp's safety to the others. Then, he and Pissel followed the path to the location where the staircase was supposed to be. Pissel insisted that the map was wrong. After all, this was a labyrinth dungeon, meaning the cartographer could have made a mistake. The protagonist asked where he got the map. Pissel explained that it had been included in the supplies provided by Count Halig. The protagonist paused, considering this information. According to the map, there should be a staircase leading downward somewhere nearby. Pissel agreed. He had come to the same conclusion. However, after searching thoroughly, he had found nothing. With frustration, he pointed out that stairs don't just grow legs and walk away. However, as they walked around, the protagonist noticed something different about the ground. Pissel asked if he had found something. Instead of answering directly, the protagonist asked if anything seemed off to him. Pissel was confused. He didn't see anything unusual. The protagonist pointed to the floor. Normally, the ground in a dungeon like this was flat and worn down due to travelers. But right where the staircase should have been, the floor was different. Now that the protagonist had pointed it out, Pissel noticed something strange. There were sharp stalagmites where none had been before. The protagonist told him to look up. Pissel did so, and his eyes widened in shock. Above them, on the ceiling, were the missing stairs. Pissel muttered in disbelief, wondering how this was possible. The protagonist knew that there was no way a staircase could have been built on the ceiling. This was obviously a trick. Most likely, magic had been used to flip the stairs upside down. He recalled that in Yuval's journal. There had been a method for breaking magical barriers. However, he wasn't sure if it would work. But at this point, he had nothing to lose. He drew his sword and hurled it toward the stairs. The moment the blade made contact, it struck a magical barrier. Immediately, the environment began to shift. Both the protagonist and Pissel watched closely as the magic unraveled before their eyes. A few moments later, the sword fell back to the ground, and the staircase returned to its normal position. Pissel stared at it in disbelief. This was indeed the missing staircase. He couldn't believe that someone had gone so far as to use magic just to hide the entrance. Meanwhile, the protagonist had a different thought. This map had been given to them by Count Halig himself. That meant he was absolutely certain that his son was in this dungeon. The protagonist wondered, had the young adventurer told his father where he was going before he disappeared? He also recalled the moment when Count Halig had hired Yuval at the time. The Count had said, "If you find my son dead, at the very least, bring back the signet ring he carries." The protagonist's mind clicked into place. That ring was more important to Count Halig than his own son. Pistol noticed his serious expression and asked if something was wrong. The protagonist wasn't sure, but something didn't feel right. Back at the camp, he gathered the group and asked them to tell him everything they knew about House Halig. Sidon looked at him, confused. They had just found the staircase, so why was he acting so serious and grim again? The protagonist explained that something seemed off and asked if they were absolutely sure that they didn't know anything. The group exchanged glances, considering his question. Finally, Canadum spoke up. Under Sanet's orders, they had actually investigated the Halig family. The protagonist was surprised. He hadn't known about this. He immediately asked why he hadn't been informed. Canadum explained that they had assumed Yuval would hate secret investigations. Besides, during their research, they had only come across rumors and gossip that in the past, Yuval had made it clear that he didn't care for hearsay. Unless he personally experienced something, he refused to let rumors cloud his judgment. Pistol reminded the protagonist of Yuval's attitude. The protagonist acknowledged that Yuval was different from him. However, the circumstances had changed. He insisted that they tell him everything they knew. The group hesitated but eventually spoke up. Count Halig had a son and a daughter. However, lately, strange rumors had been circulating. People had been whispering about the fact that Count Halig had hired a young maid, just over 20 years old. But that wasn't the strange part. The maid had a small child. It wasn't just the presence of the child that raised suspicions. It was the maid's luxurious lifestyle. She wasn't treated like an ordinary servant. She lived comfortably within the Count's estate. Naturally, people began to speculate about the true identity of the child's father. Now, the protagonist understood. This was why the Count had cared more about the ring than his own son in his mind. He kept replaying those words. Why did this still bother him so much? Then, a chilling realization hit him. Now that the Count had a new child, the son he had been raising for 20 years as his heir had suddenly become a burden to the protagonist. This still felt artificial. Sidon watched him closely. Then, he asked if Yuval was starting to suspect that this mission had something to do with Count Halig's succession. The protagonist was taken aback by the conclusion. He asked if everyone else had been thinking the same thing. He also questioned whether they realized how dangerous it was to get involved in the internal affairs of a noble house. More importantly, he asked why they had even agreed to join this mission in the first place. He pointed out that if they weren't careful, they could all be tortured or even executed just to ensure there were no loose ends. Who could guarantee what would happen to them once the mission was over? Sidon simply shrugged. He said they would worry about it when the time came. For now, it was just speculation. For now, their only job was to trust Chief Sanet. Sanet had always believed that Yuval was an honest man, and if he needed their help, he wanted to be there for him. That was enough for Sidon. Whether the mission was just or not didn't matter in the slightest. The protagonist was shocked by this response. Pistol added that if he wanted to thank someone, he should thank Sanet, because he was the one who had dragged them all into this. The protagonist looked at Sanet, who was still in pain. Suddenly, Sanet groaned, and the others rushed to check on him. Slowly, he began to stand up. The protagonist asked if he was feeling any better. Sanet grumbled that everything hurt, blaming the damn goblins. Then, he looked at the group and asked why they were acting like he was already dead. The protagonist was relieved to see him recovering. The others were glad as well. Shortly after, they were ready to move on. Sanet, now in a better mood, was excited about discovering the hidden staircase. But the protagonist thought there was nothing exciting about almost dying earlier. Sanet asked if one of Leopold's companions had placed the enchantment on the staircase. The protagonist agreed. It was highly likely. The leader urged them to hurry up, as Leopold's group could be nearby. Pistol then raised a concern. How would they recognize Count Halig's son? After all, Yuval had never seen his face before. The protagonist answered confidently. The Count's son wouldn't look anything like them as a noble. He would stand out. Elsewhere, another group was making their way through the dungeon. A young woman in the group suddenly paused, turning back to listen carefully. The others noticed her hesitation and asked if they were being followed. She shook her head. That wasn't it. But something was definitely approaching. One of her companions dismissed her concerns, saying that they were always being chased by weaklings. They had dealt with pursuers before and should just ignore them. However, the girl insisted that this time felt different. She said that whatever was approaching wasn't orcs or goblins. It was something else. One of the men in the group mocked her, saying she was thinking too much. But she argued that a woman's intuition never fails. An older man in the group spoke up. If Ale was this uneasy, Then it was better to stay alert. Still, another warrior brushed it off, saying there was nothing to worry about if their pursuers were just more fools looking for Leopold. They would deal with them easily. A strange light appeared nearby, a magic butterfly. The older man had cast it to scout the rear. He explained that if someone was following them, they would break the enchantment he had placed on the stairs. Leopold, standing among them, looked uneasy. He asked if it was them again. The old man wasn't sure. Just in case, he suggested they set traps and wait. Meanwhile, the protagonist's group continued their journey. Along the way, they found goblin corpses scattered on the ground. It was clear that someone had passed through recently. Sanet, still angry about the poisoned arrow, gritted his teeth. The protagonist warned him not to take his frustration out on the dead. Sidon chuckled, saying that Sanet had every right to be angry. After all, he was probably the most shocked by his own situation. He then reminded them that Sanet's mother was alone in their hometown, surviving only on the money he sent her. Sidon urged the protagonist to understand that despite his reckless behavior, Sanet was a good son. Hearing this, the protagonist paused. It reminded him of his own mother. For a moment, he felt uneasy. He realized that Sanet never knew when he might die as a mercenary. Yet he still pushed forward, no matter what. Sanet stated that this was the best way to earn money. And he wasn't alone. Everyone in their group had their own reasons for becoming mercenaries. Rob revealed that his brothers had joined the army while his mother was sick. Sidon admitted that he had lived alone ever since bandits raided his home. Pissel mentioned that he had many people depending on him, so he had to keep making money. The protagonist wondered, why did everyone have such tragic pasts? Despite their hardships, they still managed to keep moving forward. He, on the other hand, could never do the same. Kaydan then asked if the protagonist had any similar problems. Sanet reassured Yuval that even if something happened to him, Yuval shouldn't worry. Sanet personally guaranteed that his family would receive money from this mission. The protagonist appreciated that sentiment and vowed to do the same for him. Not only that, but he promised to look after everyone's families as if they were his own. Kaydan laughed, saying that talking was easy, but if it really came down to it, the protagonist would probably run away. In a lighter tone, the protagonist told everyone that they should all make it back home alive. The group agreed. At that moment, a system notification appeared. A special attribute had been activated. The group was now more confident in each other. As a result, everyone's speed would increase. To the protagonist, this was great news. It meant they could complete the mission faster. As they moved forward, they noticed something. The protagonist asked what was wrong. Sidon pointed ahead. In the distance, they could see another group of people. The other team also noticed. One of them remarked that the previous group of pursuers looked more like assassins, but this group seemed foolish. Another warrior warned him not to underestimate them. He explained that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who seemed harmless. His companion insisted that this group couldn't be connected to Leopold. Below them, Sanet shouted out, asking if they knew someone named Leopold. Immediately, Leopold's group became tense. One of them demanded to know who they were and what business they had with Leopold. Sanet asked if they were Leopold's companions. They confirmed that they were. The protagonist then stated that Count Halig wanted his son to return. Upon hearing this, the other group's warrior grew suspicious. He found it odd that they were so open about their intentions. The protagonist quickly realized his mistake. Something about their reaction felt off. He firmly demanded to speak with Lord Leopold. The girl in the other group scoffed. She told them they had nothing to say to Halig's lapdogs. If they didn't want to end up like the last group, they should run. Sanet's rage boiled over. Had she just called them dogs? Before they could respond, she raised a finger to the air. The ground shook. Rocks merged together, forming a massive golem. More summoned creatures emerged, and as soon as they stood, they charged. Sanet charged forward and shouted for everyone to aim for the golem's cores. Otherwise, their destroyed parts would regenerate. The protagonist rushed into battle but muttered that saying it was easier than doing it. Their weapons and attributes were too weak against the golems. Sidon, the archer, attempted to shoot one in the eye, but his arrow merely bounced off the rocky surface without reaching the target. At that moment, Sanet took a devastating kick to the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Dazed, worried about his companions, the protagonist felt his anger rise. He demanded to know why they were being attacked for no reason. Isle, however, didn't seem to care. The protagonist continued to argue, asking why she was doing this to them. But the girl insisted that they should just disappear. This only infuriated him further. Al then stated that if they ran away, she wouldn't kill them. The protagonist refused to back down, saying that this was all a misunderstanding. He asked if she was one of Lord Leopold's companions because they were allies, sent on a mission to bring him back safely. Isle, however, didn't believe him. She demanded that they tell Count Halig to stop this nefarious act of trying to kill his own son. For a moment, the protagonist and his group hesitated. Could she be telling the truth? The protagonist asked her to wait and questioned whether she was certain about what she was saying. He also asked if Leopold's father was truly Count Halig. Al scoffed and asked if he was playing dumb or if he really didn't know. The protagonist then inquired about Leopold's safety. Al confirmed that he was safe, but because of assassins like them, she wasn't sure how long that would last. They insisted that they weren't assassins, but Al snapped back that another group had said the same thing before trying to kill Leopold the moment they let their guard down. If it hadn't been for her team, Leopold would already be dead. The protagonist was stunned. Now he wasn't sure which side was telling the truth. Was Count Halig truly trying to kill his own son? Or were these people protecting Leopold based on false assumptions? Al then ordered them to leave and relay a message to their employer. Leopold was under their protection. Sanet, outraged, shouted that they weren't assassins. The protagonist, however, told him to drop it without a word. He removed his armor and dropped his equipment on the ground. Finally, he even took off his plated shirt. Al was visibly surprised. Now, without any weapons or armor, the protagonist was questioned by his team, however. He ignored them and spoke directly to Isle. He asked her what else he needed to do to prove that they were telling the truth. Still suspicious, she stared at him. Sanet asked what the protagonist was doing, but the latter simply told him to trust him. Sanet responded that if he didn't trust him, he wouldn't have come this far with him in the first place. Now fully surrendered, the protagonist raised his hands in the air and swore on his own life that he meant no harm. However, when he looked up, Al was no longer there. Using her teleportation ability, she suddenly appeared in front of him and landed a powerful kick to his chest. Even as he fell, the protagonist insisted that he was risking his honor to prove he had no ill intent. He only wanted to speak with Lord Leopold. Isle, unimpressed, asked if he really thought he could earn her trust with meaningless words. She then stated that she hated this situation and that she would kill them all. Before she could act, however, the protagonist's entire team suddenly threw their weapons to the ground. Isle was completely stunned. They declared that Yuval Pion was a man of honor, someone who taught mercenaries the true meaning of loyalty. If one life wasn't enough, then maybe 5 would be. Sanet even added that if he had 2 necks, he'd risk both in Yuval's name. The protagonist was moved by their unwavering trust. At that moment, a system notification appeared. A new ability was activated, Complete Trust. His group members were still worried, but their faith in each other had strengthened as the protagonist knelt before Isle. She was at a loss for what to do. Her team members asked her what she would do next. They also declared that if they had to die, they would die together. Suddenly, one of the golems collapsed. The loud crash startled everyone. Soon, all the golems crumbled, their broken pieces scattering across the ground. A massive explosion followed, causing both teams to retreat as they ran. From the destruction, Sanet shouted for Yuval to hurry. He didn't want him to die here. Isle, however, was caught off guard that an enemy burst through a nearby wall, a towering ogre, 3 times her size. The beast locked eyes with her before letting out a terrifying roar. For the first time, fear flashed across Isle's face. Before she could react, the protagonist appeared with a swift kick. He struck the ogre directly in the eye. Isle hadn't expected such a reaction from him, especially after everything that had just happened. The protagonist fell to the ground, and his teammates rushed toward him in concern. Sanet scolded him for charging at the enemy when they couldn't even escape. The protagonist asked Sanet to protect Isle, but his friend called him an idiot. Still, since things had come to this, they would change their formation. Sanet ordered Rob and Pistol to distract the monster, while Tsidon aimed for its eyes with arrows. Sanet then prepared to strike the ogre's foot with his axe. Believing that it was still disoriented, furious, the ogre charged toward Isle. She was still in shock, unable to move. The protagonist urged her to run with them, warning that they would all die if they stayed. The group executed their plan, drawing the ogre's attention. However, this only made the beast angrier, causing it to swing its massive axe. Sanet struck its heel, shouting for Yuval to take Isle and retreat. Isle recovered herself, realizing that she needed to assist in the fight. Using her abilities, she summoned a massive stone hand from the ground, grabbing the ogre's foot. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Sanit attacked again, wounding the beast. The ogre roared in agony. Sidon seized the moment, shooting an arrow directly into its open eye. Now, the ogre was completely blind, however. In a blind fury, it swung its weapon wildly, aiming straight for Sanit. Sidon yelled for him to get out of the way, but Sanit was too close to dodge. Just as the ogre brought down its attack, a powerful long-range strike intervened. Leopold's group had joined the battle. A crossbowman fired bolts, while a mage launched spells. The ogre was hit from multiple directions. Al was relieved to see her team step in. The protagonist urged them not to stop attacking. With renewed determination, everyone rushed the monster at once. Soon, the ogre collapsed, defeated. The protagonist felt relieved. They had all survived. But before he could celebrate, a cold blade was pressed against his neck. A knight from Leopold's group warned him not to try anything. Leopold sighed and stated that the Count no longer needed him since he now had a legitimate son. However, the protagonist pointed out that the nobility would never accept a mere infant as an heir, meaning Leopold was still the rightful successor. Leopold shook his head, saying that Yuval didn't know the whole story. When he was 14, the Count had once gotten drunk, looked at him and said, "My wife's child is standing right there." At that moment, the protagonist understood. The situation was even worse than he had imagined. Leopold was not the Count's biological son. He was the son of the Countess and another man. Leopold understood that a noble family could never publicly expose such a scandal. He wasn't entirely sure about his true lineage, but the only person who could have confirmed it had already passed away to him. However, the most important part was that the Count no longer saw him as his son. The protagonist tried to imagine the Count's perspective. It made sense that he wouldn't want to pass his title to someone who wasn't truly his child. With that in mind, the protagonist made a decision. He said he would return and inform the Count that his son had died in the labyrinth. His companions would act as witnesses to confirm that they had seen the corpse. Leopold smirked, calling him an easy person to talk to. Now, the protagonist fully understood. Leopold hadn't ventured into the labyrinth for adventure. He had done it to escape with his life. To make this plan convincing, the protagonist said he would need the ring that Leopold carried. The ring was the proof that he was the true heir of the family. However, Leopold refused to take it off. The protagonist asked if he still intended to inherit the title. Leopold shook his head, saying that he had already given up on that. But his reason was personal. The ring was the only thing he had ever received from the Count. Because of that, he had grown attached to it. Regardless of what had happened, the ring was a family heirloom. The protagonist realized that Leopold still clung to his last connection to his father. Even after being cast aside, he couldn't let go, even if it meant his own death. The protagonist thought carefully about how to convince him. Then, he told Leopold that he was a good man. Leopold was surprised and asked why he was suddenly saying that. The protagonist asked if his companions were trustworthy. Leopold confirmed that they were. They had saved his life multiple times, that he planned to stay by their side and go far away. Hearing this, the protagonist insisted that he should hand over the ring. Leopold narrowed his eyes and asked if this was a threat. Was he implying that his companions would be in danger if he didn't give up the ring? The protagonist immediately denied it. He explained that as long as Leopold possessed the ring, he would still be seen as the rightful heir. And he wasn't the only one who knew this secret. Many of the knights who served the Count were divided into different factions. If the Count ignored the tradition of primogeniture, then not just Ortal, but the entire faction supporting him would be doomed. Leopold finally understood. Whether he was alive or dead, he would still be a burden. Turning to Yuval, he admitted that he had already abandoned his family. Over time, they would forget about him. Regardless, he asked if there was any reason for him to make this sacrifice, especially when there was nothing to gain from it. The protagonist simply replied, "Because that's what family is." Leopold paused, then smiled softly. He finally understood. Turning to his grandfather, the mage, he stated that he needed to give the ring to the protagonist and needed his help. His grandfather hesitated and asked if he was sure. Then, he thanked Yuval for helping his grandson make this difficult decision. The protagonist modestly said he hadn't done much. The old mage drew a knife and warned that it would hurt. Leopold tensed as the blade was aimed at his finger. Then, without hesitation, the old man sliced it off, taking the ring along with it. The protagonist was horrified. He demanded to know why. The mage explained that the ring was enchanted with a high-ranking spell, preventing it from being removed naturally. Even the Count had likely attempted to kill his son without reason. Leopold admitted that he hadn't fled because he was a fool. Then, he turned to the protagonist and told him to make sure that this wasn't in vain. With his hands still bleeding, he handed over his family's ring. The protagonist accepted the ring, knowing it was the proof the Count needed. As he looked at Leopold's severed finger, he wondered if he would have to live like that forever. But before he could react, the mage cast a restoration spell. To his surprise, the severed finger reattached perfectly. Healing magic was truly powerful. Leopold's sister asked what Yuval planned to do now that he had the ring. His grandfather confirmed that his hand was fully healed, but pointed out that because of the goblins, they couldn't return the way they had come. It would be too exhausting in their current condition. He then mentioned that since the protagonist had helped relieve Leopold of his burden, he would repay him for the trouble. He offered to teleport them. The protagonist's group gathered together, and Sanet remarked that this was an unexpected reward. The mage said he would begin immediately since everyone was ready. Before departing, the protagonist thanked him for his help. With a chant, the old mage cast the spell that a powerful surge of magic filled the air. The protagonist was awestruck by the sheer force of it. Just before he was fully teleported, Leopold turned to Yuval. He asked if they would meet again, and said that he owed him his thanks. The protagonist was moved by his words. He responded that it was nothing. Then, they were teleported away. As the protagonist approached the light, it shone brighter than before, just like the first time he had traveled to Yuval's mission. A new system notification appeared. It declared that the mission was complete. This startled the protagonist, since the mission's success condition was to return to Count Halig's mansion. The system confirmed that he had retrieved the requested item and successfully completed Yuval Pion's mission. Additionally, he had also completed the subquest by ensuring that all group members survived. Now, the system announced that he would be teleported back to his original dimension. The protagonist thought to himself, it would have been great if he had finished earlier. Even now, it didn't feel real. Yuval Pion's life had been difficult, but he had his companions by his side. The protagonist envied that. He thought it would be amazing to have such great companions. Closing his eyes, he cherished the memories of his last mission. But when he opened his eyes again, something was wrong. The environment was completely different. The protagonist panicked. Where was he? A new system message appeared. Teleportation error detected. He was shocked. The system then issued another alert. A previous host of the simulator has requested access. A new system alert appeared, stating that he was being transported to the imaginary dimension and had to wait. The protagonist felt his body being pulled, and in the next moment, he found himself in a completely different place. From above, he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was floating over an unfamiliar city. He wondered if he was levitating due to the teleportation and felt extremely confused by everything happening, desperately wishing for an explanation. But from this height, he noticed something familiar. Sanet and Rob were walking along the streets nearby. They were chatting casually, with Rob mentioning that Yuval should start thinking about his plans, since he was about to receive a large reward. That was when the protagonist realized something shocking. He was no longer inside Yuval's body. The character he had been controlling all this time was now moving independently. This deeply unsettled him. As Yuval walked alongside his companions, something even more inexplicable happened. A floating figure appeared beside the protagonist. Noticing this presence, he flinched. When he turned to look, he found himself face to face with Yuval. He couldn't comprehend it. Yuval was standing right there, yet at the same time, he was down below, walking with his friends. Yuval Pion then introduced himself as the client of the protagonist. He said it was a pleasure to meet Chu Kang in person. The protagonist was even more confused. Yuval noticed his expression and smiled. Kang admitted that none of this made sense. He thought his mission had ended, yet he was still here. Moreover, he never expected to meet Yuval in person. Yuval explained that this wasn't real. It was merely a scene he wanted Kang to witness. The scene before them showed his friends walking happily beside Yuval. Yuval stated that he had a request for the protagonist, which was why he arranged this meeting. The protagonist asked what he wanted. Instead of answering, Yuval transported them to another location. Now they were hovering over Count Halig's mansion. From this vantage point, they saw the real Yuval standing with Pissel. The two were talking, but Pissel looked uneasy and dissatisfied. Suddenly, Pissel apologized to Yuval. The next second, he drew a blade and stabbed him in the abdomen. Yuval collapsed, bleeding out, looking at Pissel in disbelief. He weakly asked why. Pissel, his voice trembling, explained that his family had been taken hostage. If he didn't obey the Count's orders, they would all be killed. The protagonist and Yuval's spirit observed the scene from above. Yuval revealed that this was what happened right after the mission was completed. The Count orchestrated everything to ensure no one uncovered his secret. The protagonist was horrified. He never expected this from Pissel. Yuval then explained the truth about the mission. He stated that the mission Kang had completed came at the cost of his own soul. Even after his death, the contract remained active. However, he wasn't the only one to fulfill it. He revealed that, although Sidon and Rob died in the labyrinth, the rest of his group succeeded in capturing Leopold. The protagonist asked if that meant Leopold had been taken by force. Yuval confirmed. Unlike the protagonist, his team had no other choice. Shu Kang realized that Yuval had access to knowledge beyond what a normal spirit should. Yuval told him not to be so surprised. After becoming a spirit, he discovered new possibilities beyond life. The protagonist remembered how he had obtained Leopold's ring simply by persuading him. That he asked if Yuval had encountered resistance from Leopold's group. However, Yuval explained that he never even saw them. By the time he arrived, they were already dead, massacred by the ogre. The protagonist realized how differently events had unfolded in Yuval's version of the mission. In Yuval's case, everyone in Leopold's group had perished. Yuval commented that it was strange someone from Kang's side had survived, as others who had tried to intervene in history failed. The protagonist asked what Yuval wanted from him. What kind of regret kept him clinging to this mission even after death? Yuval pointed out that Kang had obtained Leopold's ring solely through persuasion. Then, he challenged him. Why not try persuading Pissel and the Count? The protagonist studied the scene before him. He realized that he wouldn't have died in this situation. Pissel had been placed in an impossible position with no choices. He then asked if this was Yuval's final request. The protagonist suddenly understood. These were not just NPCs repeating scripted actions. As long as conversation was possible, there was still a chance. Yuval smiled, eager to see what Kang would do. Suddenly, the protagonist was transported back into his body, just before Pissel's attack. This time, he dodged the stab. Pissel was stunned. Even the Count couldn't believe his eyes. The protagonist understood. This was the exact moment when the next series of events should have played out. However, persuading Pissel and the Count wouldn't be easy. Pissel, still determined, lunged at him again. At that moment, the protagonist saw a small opening. He grabbed Pissel's wrist, stopping the attack. The young man's eyes widened in shock. Without hesitation, the protagonist twisted Pissel's arm and pinned him to the ground. Then, looking directly into his eyes, he said, "If you do what the Count orders, everyone will die." The boy didn't understand what the protagonist meant, but he insisted that he think carefully. He then asked why the Count wanted him dead. He stated that it was because Pissel knew the secret of his lineage. However, the same applied to the entire group. With that, the protagonist questioned what made Pissel believe that the Count would let him live. Pissel, however, dismissed it. He said that he didn't care about himself because his family had been kidnapped. The Count had promised to let them go if he killed Yuval and all of his companions. The protagonist turned to the Count, his eyes burning with rage. Then, he asked if Pissel really believed that. Pissel hesitated but insisted that the Count had promised him a high social status and a handsome reward. The protagonist then asked, "Do you think someone who breaks his promises to a knight would keep his word to a mere mercenary?" Pissel's expression changed as he began to realize the trap he had fallen into. The protagonist pushed further, stating that if Pissel went through with this, his family would still be killed afterward. Then, he turned back to the Count and asked if that wasn't true. Pissel, now visibly uncertain, waited for the Count's response. However, the Count remained composed and stated that once Pissel completed his task, he would ensure his family's safety and provide him with a considerable reward. Protagonist scoffed. He asked Pissel if he was really going to fall for the same lie twice and abandon his family. To the mention of his family, Pissel snapped, fueled by rage. He broke free from the protagonist's hold. The protagonist panicked. Pissel, now completely enraged, grabbed his dagger once again and lunged toward the Count, shouting that he wasn't stupid enough to believe his lies a second time. He aimed straight for him, however. The Count didn't even flinch. He stood calmly in place. Just as Pissel was about to strike, something unexpected happened. The Count moved first with blinding speed. He struck Pissel down. Pissel collapsed onto the Count's desk, blood spilling from his wound. The protagonist was stunned. He hadn't been able to predict the Count's movements. He wondered, Was the Count really that skilled? As the Count stepped toward him, the protagonist noticed something concerning. He didn't have a sword. The Count smirked. He remarked that Yuval had forced him to dirty his own hands. He knew that Yuval had been disarmed at the entrance and admitted that his original plan was to have them kill each other under the guise of a reward. However, he had changed his mind. Now, he would finish Yuval off himself. The protagonist was in serious trouble. There was nothing around him that he could use as a weapon. The moment he blinked, he would be attacked. The Count was closing in fast. He commented that Yuval had handled the mission in a strange way. He had heard that Yuval never even crossed swords with that boy. The protagonist immediately realized he was talking about Leopold. He then asked the Count, "What did you expect me to do?" The Count responded, saying that he had never expected Yuval to return with the ring without spilling any blood. The protagonist explained that the ring was important to Leopold. He even said that it was the only thing he had ever received from the Count. He then asked, "And yet, he still gave it up so easily?" In his thoughts, the protagonist questioned why the Count was even asking him these things. That he had expected the Count to kill him immediately. But now, he saw an opportunity. That he decided to prolong the conversation and use it to his advantage. Looking at the Count, he said, "It wasn't as simple as you think." The moment the Count heard that, his expression darkened. The protagonist noticed it right away. That was why the Count hadn't attacked yet. Realizing this, he continued to talk, determined to use this opportunity to turn the situation in his favor. He stated that before Leopold handed over the ring, there was one thing he had been absolutely firm about. The protagonist considered the situation carefully. He figured that the Count must have at least some lingering feelings for Leopold. So he told the Count that Leopold wanted to live by his father's side, protecting him as a loyal son. Even though the Count seemed indifferent, the protagonist insisted. That he stated that Leopold never resented living beside his father. As he spoke, he noticed a change in the Count's expression. Perhaps, for a moment, the Count felt a hint of guilt. The Count then asked if that was the condition for Leopold to hand over the ring. The protagonist confirmed it. He added that Leopold had given it in exchange for a promise. Hearing this, the Count muttered that he always knew Leopold was a peculiar child. But the idea that he would give up the family ring just for a few words left him doubtful. The protagonist clarified that it wasn't just that by chance. He had explored the dungeon alongside Leopold and his companions. They had gone through life and death situations. Together, during that time, Leopold observed him and decided that he was trustworthy. Only after that did he hand over the ring. The protagonist stated that he had earned Leopold's trust and, since he had made a promise, he would now swear absolute loyalty to the Count. He then knelt before him, showing complete seriousness. The Count stared at him for a moment. Then, he suddenly burst into laughter. The protagonist was confused. The Count remarked that he always knew Yuval was stubborn and asked, "How? Can you say something like that in this situation?" To him, the words sounded like empty promises, made just to escape death. The protagonist began to worry that his plan had failed. However, the Count then did something unexpected. He said that he would accept the oath. Stepping closer, he raised his sword, saying that he would make sure Yuval paid for it with his life. The moment the Count swung his blade, the protagonist dodged just in time. As he did, he spoke again, saying that this very situation was the reason he needed to keep his oath. The Count paused. He asked what Yuval meant by that. The protagonist responded that, while he was not a strategist, he wasn't ignorant of tactics either. The Count sighed, telling him to get to the point. The protagonist then explained that a knight who appeared honest and trustworthy wasn't always what they seemed. A knight who looked naive might actually be quite cunning. The Count's expression changed slightly. The protagonist noticed this. He thought that having total control over someone who appeared reliable to others could be very useful. Every time the Count planned something, Yuval could be his greatest asset. He then added that his voice could be used however the Count wished. If he claimed that he had personally confirmed Leopold's death, no one would doubt him. The Count narrowed his eyes and asked if he was trying to bargain. But the protagonist replied that this wasn't a bargain. It was an equivalent exchange. The only thing the Count needed to do was honor his previous promise. The protagonist pointed out that the Count should know how important the reward was to him. His family's situation was dire. He also swore that he would never betray someone to whom he owed his life. Hearing this, the Count smirked. He remarked that Yuval was far more dangerous than he had expected. His cunning left the Count astounded. The protagonist responded with an old saying, "Keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer." The Count found this amusing. He admitted that he had never expected things to turn out this way. However, He posed another question. What would Yuval do about the mercenaries who had helped him during the mission? The protagonist pointed out that Pissel was already gone. He then mentioned that he had an idea of how to handle the situation, but he needed permission first. The Count chuckled and asked if Yuval really needed permission for that moment. The protagonist revealed his real plan. He would replace the true story with an entirely fabricated lie. He would spread the rumor that the Count's beloved wife had betrayed him, giving birth to a child with another man. Upon hearing this, the Count's expression darkened with rage. He immediately reprimanded Yuval for such words. This was his greatest secret, however. The protagonist knew he had to say it. The Count eventually told him to continue, but he warned that if Yuval was treating this as a joke, he would regret it until his dying breath. Now, the Count was waiting for the full explanation. The protagonist knew that one wrong move and he could be executed on the spot, so carefully he crafted the fabricated story. He claimed that whenever the Count saw his illegitimate son, Leopold, he was reminded of his wife's betrayal. Because of that, he constantly scolded his son. But, naively, Leopold always followed his father, believing he could win his approval. This only deepened the Count's pain that in the end, the Count made a cruel decision. He resolved everything by simply reclaiming the family ring. The protagonist based this lie on real observations. He had seen the Count's interactions with Leopold and understood his emotional turmoil. The Count then asked if this fake story would really be enough to keep the mercenaries silent. He doubted that they would believe it. Judging by the Count's reaction, the protagonist realized that it was genuine. He then told the Count that mercenaries leave their homes every year in search of money. These men who didn't fear death had one common fear: betrayal by their wives. He explained that threats and bribes might not keep them silent. But this story was different. It would make them empathize with the Count. Since the story revolved around betrayal, they would sympathize with the Count's pain. As long as the humiliation and suffering were covered up, they would keep quiet. The Count remained uncertain. He found it hard to believe that a mere mercenary could understand his feelings. The protagonist observed the Count's reaction. He wasn't sure, but he felt this was a good sign. The Count then asked, "What will you do if Leopold ever returns?" The protagonist replied that there was nothing to worry about. He was certain that Leopold would never return. The Count asked if he was sure. The protagonist confidently explained that Leopold valued those he cared about. He had a warm heart. Because of that, he wouldn't return. He knew it would only bring problems for both of them, and more than anything, he still loved his father. This answer seemed to convince the Count. He admitted that Leopold had always been too kind. Perhaps it would have been better if he hadn't been. Then, he commented that Yuval was truly exceptional. He would make a fine storyteller. Finally, the Count turned to Yuval. He asked what was most important for a knight on the battlefield. Even without understanding why he was being asked, the protagonist answered, "Their spirit." The Count agreed that spirit, swords, and armor were important. However, the most important thing was the horse. Horses were powerful, untamed beasts, but with proper training, they could become deadly weapons. The Count then declared that Yuval was like a warhorse. Thus, he should follow him loyally. He extended his sword, touching the protagonist's face, and renamed him Yuval Halls. The protagonist agreed, but before leaving, he requested medical attention for PZLL. His time suddenly froze. He saw the real Yuval above him. Yuval then asked if the protagonist was satisfied with his results. Something seemed wrong with Yuval. The protagonist tried to speak to him, but Yuval suddenly let out a loud scream. Kang was shocked, wondering what was happening to him as Yuval continued to scream. The protagonist tried to calm him down and asked what had happened to make him react this way. Yuval, his voice filled with anguish, questioned why things hadn't ended differently. He believed that he should have been able to save everyone. Now that he saw that it had actually been possible, he was experiencing a collapse of consciousness. He admitted that he had always believed that if he did his best, he would be rewarded. But in the end, things weren't that simple. With that, Yuval thanked Kang. He said that his long illusion was finally coming to an end. He hoped that Kang had learned a lesson from his foolish life and would be blessed with wisdom. However, Kang protested. He insisted that this wasn't fair. He said that he would never be able to gather companions like Yuval had. Yuval already had his friends' trust and their hearts. That was the only reason Kang had succeeded. Because of Yuval's bonds, Kang was able to complete the mission. He declared that Yuval's life had not been foolish. The protagonist then added that Yuval could have been a little more open-minded and listened to others more. Yuval chuckled, saying that Sanat once told him the same thing. but he believed that the difference between them was Kang's heart. The protagonist felt embarrassed by the statement. Then, Yuval extended a gift to him that he told Kang that it was a fragment of his soul. His last source of pride that he entrusted it to Kang, stating that he was capable of taking care of it. Kang admitted that he didn't know how to use it, but he accepted the gift with gratitude. Suddenly, he was teleported again. This time, he landed in a vast field of crops. Looking around, Kang wondered where he had been sent now. From above, he saw a group of people greeting a lord as he approached. To Kang's shock, the nobleman was an older Yuval. As Yuval passed by the people, they welcomed him warmly. In a carriage beside him, a woman stepped out and distributed food to the people. The protagonist quickly recognized them. This was Yuval's family. Yuval explained that this was his promised reward for selling his soul and devoting his life to the contract. He admitted that he had waited a long time for this mission to be completed. But in the end, Kang was the one who had truly accomplished it. However, the protagonist wasn't. Convinced, he realized that this wasn't reality. It was just a fabricated dream meant to comfort Yuval. This was the price he had paid for selling his soul. Yuval had never craved power or wealth. All he had ever wanted was for his family to live in peace. But in his pursuit of that dream, he had lost everything and fallen into an endless abyss of suffering. The protagonist sighed in frustration. He questioned why the world was so cruel. And more importantly, why had a man like Yuval chosen to sell his soul? Yuval, however, responded with a question of his own. He asked why a man like Kang, someone who could see into the hearts of others, had chosen to work in this kind of business. The protagonist hesitated to answer. Then, he simply gave a vague response, saying that the world wasn't easy. Before he could say anything else, a bright light appeared. He immediately realized that he was being teleported again. He wondered where he would end up this time. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally going home. The company headquarters. At the company headquarters, Wu Sunri was busy working on several panels. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Shu Kang had achieved a perfect resolution. This mission had been doomed to fail from the start, yet somehow, he had succeeded. Not only that, but he had even completed the extra stage. She turned to her assistant secretary and ordered her to investigate Kang further. As the protagonist stared at the system panel, he struggled to process what had just happened. A new system message appeared. The member's rank will now be updated to level 3. Additionally, he had received a special item, Yuval Pion's soul fragment. Moments later, he was teleported back to his original dimension. Wu Sunri greeted him with a smile. On behalf of the organization, she thanked him. She praised his efforts, saying that he had made an impressive move. 2 perfect solutions in a row made him truly remarkable. She added that Yuval's spirit had expressed his deepest gratitude to him. While they were talking, the secretary noticed something strange. Meanwhile, the protagonist couldn't shake a certain feeling. Something was bothering him. He remembered that, according to Yuval, he was the first person to ever complete this mission. So, Kang confronted Wu Sunri. He asked if she had sent him expecting him to fail. Wu Sunri denied it. She claimed that they had simply decided to make things more convenient for him. Kang didn't buy it. He demanded to know how exactly they had made things convenient. He then stated outright that he preferred fighting monsters over killing humans. Wu Sunri smirked. She explained that she had worked hard to find a suitable mission for him. But then she asked, "Would you rather be sent to a battlefield instead?" She quickly added that it didn't matter now. After all, Mr. Kang had succeeded once again. More importantly, he had returned in one piece. The protagonist rolled his eyes. He sarcastically asked if he should be grateful, but Wu Sunri told him not to be. After all, they hadn't even informed him that it was an impossible mission. Kang thought to himself that this woman was incredibly cunning. Meanwhile, the secretary was calculating his earnings. She explained that he received 5% from the mission, plus the 10% bonus. That made it a total of 15%. After converting 3 gold coins from Tail Road into their currency, his earnings came out to 4,800,000 won. The amount stunned Kang. It wasn't a small sum, but after everything he had gone through, it felt a little underwhelming. He tried to negotiate. He suggested rounding his earnings up to 5 million. After all, he had achieved a perfect resolution and saved every single member of the mercenary group. He also remembered that in his previous mission as Parsons, he had earned 1.5 million won for just 1% of the mission. So how could 15% only be 4.8 million? Wu Sunri then clarified something. She explained that Parsons had been a special case. His mission had included extra earnings from loot. However, the titles and territories granted from being knighted were not included in the calculations. That was Yuval's spirit's problem. The real mission had only been about retrieving the ring. With this realization, the protagonist concluded that he had essentially worked for free and had overworked himself to the point of exhaustion. Wu Sunri, however, corrected him. She pointed out that he had received Yuval's reward. As the protagonist contemplated her words, the soul fragment of Yuval suddenly materialized before him. Sunri then explained that since it was a rare item, they would offer him a high price for it. She proposed 8 million won in exchange for the soul fragment. The protagonist found this interesting. The item itself was worth more than the entire mission reward, but in a way, it felt like Yuval had given him his most valuable possession. Kang hesitated and asked if he needed to sell the item right away. The secretary intervened, explaining that he could sell it whenever he wanted, or even use it instead if he preferred. However, Kang had no idea how to use it. Wu Sunri elaborated, stating that it could be used to gain attributes such as Yuval's power and courage. Essentially, he could inherit some of Yuval's abilities while he was still alive. Kang admitted that this could be useful for future missions. Shifting the topic, he sought clarification on something. He asked if Yuval would remain in that world. Sunri confirmed that he would stay there until the next client appeared. Until then, Yuval would be able to enjoy a peaceful dream thanks to Kang's intervention. The protagonist then questioned, "So, does that mean that when a new mission starts, the world resets?" Sunri nodded. This made Kang reflect on his last mission. He concluded that those moments must have been the most painful ones of Yuval's life. He had been forced to watch himself continuously fail. Kang shuddered. If it had been himself in that situation, reliving the worst moments of his life over and over again, he would have lost his mind. He thought back to an event from 3 years ago. If that moment had replayed infinitely in front of his eyes, it would have been unbearable. That moment. Wu Sunri's tone changed. She told him to listen carefully to what she was about to say. Kang noticed the shift in her demeanor. Something about this felt different. She then revealed that, throughout his life, Kang had experienced numerous misfortunes, and no matter what he did, things always went wrong. Kang was taken aback. He asked what she meant by that. Sunri, speaking bluntly, stated that they had run a simulation based on his life data. Kang immediately felt uneasy. He didn't like the sound of this. Sunri went on, explaining that his misfortune rate was incomprehensibly high. It was almost as if someone was playing with his fate. The protagonist was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sunri then warned him. If he didn't find a way to deal with his karma, a great tragedy would occur in his life. Kang felt a chill run down his spine. Nervously, he asked, "What exactly is going to happen to me?" Wu Sunri admitted that they didn't have a definitive answer. However, she could say with certainty that he would experience something so painful that he would wish for death. The protagonist, however, brushed it off. He insisted that a mere simulation couldn't predict everything about his life, and the idea that someone was manipulating his fate was absurd. He asked if misfortune was really something that could be changed just by wanting it to. Wu Sunri simply smirked. She offered to explain it again, but in truth, there wasn't much more she could say. However, she did have an answer for him. She stated that if he wanted to change his karma, there was only one way: he had to reach level 10. She explained that the benefits and rewards at that level were on an entirely different scale than what he was used to. Once he reached that level, his world would transform completely. These rewards would be enough to change his destiny. Kang found this highly intriguing. He noted that he had already reached level 3 after completing just 2 missions. Reaching level 10 sounded difficult but possible. His body trembled with excitement. The moment, he had no other way to earn money, so he accepted the challenge. He asked when his next mission would begin. Wu Sunri smiled. She was pleased that she had convinced him. She told him that they would contact him again soon. Walking through the city after leaving the company headquarters, Kang walked through the streets for a while. He felt exhausted and noticed aches in his body. He realized that the injuries he sustained during the mission had left real marks. He remembered that his reward had been converted into money instead of gold coins. So he checked his account on his phone. To his frustration, he noticed a 5% exchange rate deduction. His final balance showed approximately 4.5 million won. This meant that, in total, he had earned nearly 6 million won in just a few days. He also recalled what Wu Sunri had told him about level 10. He wondered if money alone would be enough to overcome the unfortunate events in his life. Kang knew that his family was suffering. They were drowning in massive debts and struggling with his mother's hospital bills. The reason he had been betrayed by someone he once called a friend was also because of money. However, he now had a solution. If he could reach level 10, everything would be resolved. Back at the company headquarters, the secretary posed a question. She asked if someone with such an insanely high karma score had ever existed before. Then, she bluntly stated, "Isn't he basically the personification of misfortune?" Wu Sunri sighed. She explained that with a karma score that high, it was almost guaranteed that Kang would end up taking his own life in a few years. Wu Sunri revealed that they had run another simulation based on Kang's recent successes, but the results were not as expected. The secretary asked if she planned to check in on Mr. Kang. Sunri replied that she couldn't afford to leave such a valuable asset unattended. After all, both Parsons and Yuval's missions had been perfectly resolved, and Kang had already reached level 3 after just 2 missions. She then asked how many missions remained. The secretary responded, 12. Sunri then inquired, "Can you calculate his total experience if he completes all 12 missions perfectly?" The secretary hesitated for a moment. She then asked if the president really believed that Mr. Kang was capable of such a feat. However, Wu Sunri didn't answer. She simply ordered her to calculate it. The secretary did as requested and reported that if Kang successfully completed all 12 missions, he would gain 34 million experience points and reach approximately level 17. Sunri knew that level 17 was incredibly high. She remarked that this was a rare opportunity to clear all the lower level missions. However, if they allowed Kang to level up too quickly, it would leave a trace in his record. Sunri took a moment to think about her next move. Then, she made a decision. She ordered the secretary to increase his karma even more. She asked if raising it by another 3 million would work. The secretary was stunned. Instead of reducing it, Sunri wanted to increase it even further. She warned that if Kang couldn't handle it, he might break if he ended up taking his own life. The central office would find out. However, Sunri calmly dismissed the concern. She told her she wasn't actually ordering it, only asking for calculations. Then, she made another request. She ordered the removal of all support from Kang's family and friends. Immediately, a system alert popped up. His luck had plummeted drastically. Sunri smirked. That should be enough. The secretary hesitated. She wasn't sure if the president was making the right call. However, Wu Sunri reassured her. She said that even if Kang gained a massive amount of experience, they could simply convert it into money. Finally, she ordered the secretary to drain Mr. Kang's bank account into the negatives. That way, they could deposit funds into it whenever they wanted. The secretary asked, "Do you really think this will all be solved with money?" Sunri laughed. She confidently stated, "Knowing Mr. Kang, he'll probably accept it on his knees." She added that, on this planet, especially in Korea, money solves everything. Before leaving, she declared that she would contact the central office. She wanted to place 24-hour surveillance on Kang. She couldn't afford to lose such an exceptional talent. She planned to support him and help him grow quickly. Because once he finished all his missions, he would be sitting on a fortune. Kang's first taste of success. Kang walked through the streets, carrying a shopping bag with a huge smile on his face. For the first time, he had been able to buy a large amount of meat with his own money. He was overjoyed. His family would finally have a real feast. Something they hadn't done in half a year. To him, money was always a good thing. For the first time in a while, he felt stable and secure. His anxiety had disappeared as he walked home. He did some quick calculations in his head. Rent, credit card bills, daily expenses, and his mother's hospital fees. He had so many overdue debts that 3 million won would be gone in an instant. But there was another problem. How would he explain the sudden money to his family? He considered telling them that he had found a new job. Or that he had won it through gambling. Since it was a large amount, he knew his family would be suspicious. After thinking for a while, he came up with the best excuse. He would tell them he won the money through betting. An unwanted reunion. As soon as he reached his apartment complex, he heard someone call his name. Kang was just about to enter his passcode at the door. He froze. The voice was familiar. When he turned around, he immediately recognized the MNIT was Cho Minhun. His hands clenched into fists. He let go of his shopping bag, his rage boiling over. Without a word, he marched toward Cho Minhun and called him every insult he could think of. Then, without hesitation, he punched him square in the face. Cho collapsed onto the ground. Kang grabbed him by the collar, shaking him. "What the hell are you doing here? Do you want to die?" Cho struggled to respond. Kang wasn't interested in excuses. "What are you doing here after destroying my family?" Finally, Cho managed to say, "Wait, it's about your sister." Kang paused. Cho repeated his words, urging him to just listen. Still fuming, Kang gritted his teeth. He warned Cho that if he was about to say something stupid, he would kill him. But Cho merely grinned and said, "You're unbelievable, punching me just for showing my face." His smug attitude infuriated Kang even more. He knew exactly what this bastard had done to his family. And now, here he was, acting like nothing had happened. Kang concluded that Cho was asking to die. He grabbed a glass bottle from his bag and smashed it on the ground, breaking it into a sharp weapon. Holding the jagged glass, he glared at Cho. "Enough stalling. Spit it out." Just looking at Cho's face made him sick. Cho's expression finally changed. He sighed and admitted, "I have bad news." He added that he couldn't tell him while he was holding a weapon. Kang pressed him again, growing impatient. Finally, Cho revealed, "I went out drinking last night, and I ran into you." Kang froze. Cho continued, "It was at a host bar. I didn't know she worked there." He quickly defended himself, saying that he hadn't touched her and had even told her to quit immediately. Apparently, she had signed a contract worth 70 million won, but Cho claimed that he had torn it up. He also mentioned that it seemed like Kang's family didn't know about it yet. He figured that if they ignored it, it might turn into a bigger problem later. Kang demanded, "When was this?" Cho responded, "Last night. They told me it was her second day working there." Kang felt his anger surge even further. He glared at Cho and asked, "So, you came all the way here just to tell me this?" Cho nodded. He warned that the place had a terrible reputation and that if you kept working there, it could lead to serious problems. But Kang didn't care about Cho's concern. To him, Cho was just the bastard who ruined his family. He remembered something he had heard before. The first time you kill someone, it's difficult, but the second time it gets easier. For a moment, he seriously considered it, but then he took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm. He couldn't bring more trouble to his family by becoming a murderer. After hearing Cho's words, Kang demanded to know the location of the establishment, without wasting any time. He hailed a taxi and headed straight there. The moment he stepped out of the car, his eyes locked onto the sign in front of the building. He walked forward, confirming that this was the right place. Before entering, he took a deep breath. This wasn't how his sister should be making a living. Determined, Kang pushed open the door and stepped inside. As soon as he entered, the receptionist greeted him. "Are you alone, sir? Or do you have a reservation?" But Kang ignored the formalities. He cut straight to the point. "Is there someone named Yonu working here?" The staff members froze. The receptionist's expression changed slightly. Realizing that Kang was looking for someone specific, the receptionist asked, "What is this about?" Kang didn't want to waste time. "I already know she works here. You know Chinsu, right? He's a regular." He then lied, saying that Cho had asked him to pass on a message to Yonu. For a moment, Kang considered just telling them that he was her brother, but before he could, the receptionist signaled to one of the female staff, "Go check on her." The woman nodded. "She's already serving customers. She's in room 5. The receptionist turned back to Kang. "I'm afraid I can't interrupt her in the middle of service. Would you like to leave a message, or would you prefer to wait?" Kang, however, wasn't interested in either option. Without another word, he stormed off toward room 5. The receptionist tried to stop him. "Sir, you can't just barge in. This is a business. We have rules." But Kang shoved him aside and kept moving. The receptionist stumbled to the floor. Kang didn't care. His only focus was getting to room 5. He ran through the hallways, searching for the right door. The moment he found it, he threw it open without hesitation. A confrontation inside the room inside. A group of men were drinking and laughing, surrounded by several women. The atmosphere was loud and festive. One of the men frowned at Kang's sudden entrance. "Who the hell are you? We didn't call for another guest." Ignoring him, Kang scanned the room. Then, he saw her. "Yonu!" His sister froze. She turned toward him, her face filled with shock. "Kang, what are you doing here?" One of the customers, noticing the tension, asked, "Hey, who is this guy?" Kang glared at him. His cold, sharp eyes sent a clear message. Back off. The man took a step back, feeling uneasy. Without another word, Kang grabbed Yonu's arm and pulled her out of the room. Come with me. His grip was firm. She struggled, trying to resist. Kang! Wait, how did you even find this place? She then asked, was it Cho? Did he tell you? But Kang didn't answer. He was too furious to have a conversation right now. Be quiet. We'll talk after we leave this place. She had no choice but to follow him at a hostile encounter at the reception as they reached the main entrance. A large man stood waiting for them. The receptionist, still recovering from earlier, called out, Sir, you're disrupting our business. His tone had completely changed. How do you plan to compensate for ruining our customers' experience? Before Kang could respond, the large man stepped forward. Then, without warning, he punched Kang in the stomach. Yonu gasped in shock. Kang! But Kang had been through much worse. Without hesitation, he headbutted the man with full force. Crack! The man collapsed instantly. Blood trickled down his forehead as he lay motionless on the floor. Kang straightened up and stared at the receptionist. So, a single punch counts as business disruption? What kind of ridiculous place is this? Yonu tried to stop him. Kang! That's enough! But the receptionist was pale with fear. Kang turned to him, unbothered. Do you still want compensation? The man quickly shook his head. Not wanting any more trouble, Kang grabbed Yonu's arm once again and dragged her out of the building. A heated argument. Kang walked through the streets, still boiling with rage. Yonu winced as he held her wrist too tightly. You're hurting me! But he wasn't listening. She then yanked her arm away with force. Let go of me! Kang turned sharply toward her. Are you out of your damn mind? You're making money in a place like that. Why? His voice was filled with fury. Why didn't you find something else? Do you even care about our parents? Do you even feel ashamed? But to his shock, Yonu suddenly started laughing. Kang stared at her. What the hell is so funny? Still chuckling, she wiped a tear from her eye. Then, she looked him dead in the eye and said, You really don't know anything, do you? Kang felt a pit form in his stomach. What are you talking about? She sighed and crossed her arms. I don't feel ashamed. Not even a little. Why should I? Kang was speechless. She then asked, Do you even realize how much debt our family has? Kang felt his heart sink. Of course. He knew. Yonu narrowed her eyes. After Mom's accident, while you were too shocked to function, Dad and I were the ones paying the bills. The hospital fees, the daily expenses, everything. Do you think just the two of us could have covered it all? Her voice trembled. Even if I worked a corporate job, it wouldn't be enough. Do you think I do this because I want to? Do you think I enjoy drinking and smiling all night? Her anger boiled over. The debt is over 100 million won. The interest alone is 100,000 won per month. Kang couldn't believe what he was hearing. Yonu wiped her tears away and scoffed. Meanwhile, where were you? Locked away in your room. You have no right to call yourself my brother now. Kang felt his entire body stiffen. Every word hit him like a knife, because everything she said was true. His sister was suffering, and part of that was his fault. But even so, he clenched his fists. You could have told me before deciding to work in a place like that. His voice was quieter now. I could have found another way to get the money. His sister expressed frustration, saying that if paying off the debt had been that easy, they would have been free long ago. Kang asked how much was still left to pay, but she told him that she had already handled it while he had been isolating himself. He didn't understand at first, but when he realized what she meant, he asked if she had taken an advance from those people. She admitted it, and he immediately reacted with concern, asking how much she had received. She responded that she had taken 40 million won. Hearing the amount, Kang was in shock. He realized the consequences of taking money from a place like that and told her to return it immediately. However, she explained that it was already gone, having been used to pay off their family's debts. With nothing left to give back, she was now bound to the club until she could repay the loan. He could hardly process what she was saying and felt overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. The realization hit him that his sister, whom he had always seen as innocent and naive, had gone to such extremes to keep their family afloat. He questioned whether she had always been like this and he had simply failed to notice. His thoughts drifted to what Wu Sunri had said about karma, about how misfortune followed him and affected his family as well. The idea crept into his mind that perhaps his own situation had led her down this path. He told her to quit immediately, suggesting that she either find another job or stay home. She pushed back, insisting that he wasn't listening and that he didn't understand how things worked. She asked if he had any real alternatives and reminded him of the crushing weight of their family's debts. The amount was massive, with interest piling up every month, making it impossible for them to climb out of their situation. As she broke down in tears, he remained silent. He knew she was right. She had been suffering all this time, and part of it was because of him. Still, he told her that she should have come to him before making a decision like this. He insisted that there were other ways to get the money. She responded that if it had been that easy, they would have already been free. Kang then asked how much was currently owed, but she reminded him that she had already handled it. He didn't understand how she had managed that, but when the realization set in, he asked if she had borrowed the money in advance. She confirmed it, and his frustration grew. The consequences of borrowing from a club like that were severe. He demanded that she return the money immediately, but she explained that it was too late. Everything had been used to settle their debts. Now, she was locked into working there until she could pay it back. Kang was horrified by the situation that he took a moment to collect himself and then told her that she needed to quit right away. She argued that she had no choice and that if there were a better option, she would have taken it already. He assured her that she no longer had to worry about money because he would handle it. She was skeptical, asking how he intended to do that. He simply told her that he would find a way. She warned him not to do anything drastic, but he reassured her that it wasn't necessary. To prove it, he pulled out his phone and showed her his recent earnings. She was taken aback, asking how he had made so much money. He simply explained that he had found a well-paying job and that she no longer needed to continue working at the club. Overwhelmed with emotion, she broke down, finally relieved of the burden she had been carrying alone. Later, Kang returned to the company headquarters and confronted Wu Sunri, demanding the most profitable mission available. He was determined to reach level 10 as quickly as possible. She seemed amused by his determination, questioning if he was really that eager. He reaffirmed his resolve, emphasizing that he had risked his life in past missions and was willing to do so again. Sunri noted that his urgency stemmed from his sister's situation. Kang realized that she had read his mind again. She apologized for mentioning his personal life, but he dismissed it, getting straight to the point and asking if there was a mission worth 40 million won. She confirmed that there was. Without hesitation, Kang asked to be sent immediately. However, Sunri hesitated before responding, giving him a strange look. He felt a sense of unease and pressed for an answer. She explained that if he accepted the mission now, he would die without a doubt. Kang asked if there was even the slightest chance of survival, but she was firm in her response. The risk level was absolute. She went on to explain the concept of synchronization rate, which determined how much damage he would experience during a mission. At his current level, the safety limit was set at 5%, but as the rewards increased, so did the risk, eventually reaching 100%. Hearing this, Kang realized that his plan had been reckless. He had assumed he could take on a high-paying mission to solve everything in one go, but now he understood the true danger. Sunri reminded him that dying wouldn't help his family and told him not to forget that. Kang reflected on the situation. This job was his only hope of pulling his family out of their struggles, but he couldn't afford to be reckless. He asked for the most lucrative mission available that he could realistically handle. Sunri stated that no such mission was available at the moment. Kang asked when one would be, but she only responded that she wasn't sure. He suspected that she either didn't have anything available or was deliberately delaying until they assigned him something specific. She told him that they would contact him as soon as possible and that he needed to wait as he left the building. He felt disoriented. He had promised his sister that he would handle everything, but now he had no way to fulfill that promise. He started considering alternatives, but no matter what he thought of, nothing seemed feasible. He even considered asking his former friend for help, but quickly abandoned the idea. The amount was too high, and he couldn't afford to owe that kind of money. Walking down the streets, he saw several advertisements for loan services. He considered going to a bank, but remembered that he had already been rejected before due to his low balance. As he pondered his options, he realized that he might have to resort to something similar to what his sister had done. The thought filled him with dread. Later that evening, he returned to the company headquarters. Sunri was surprised to see him again. Desperation evident in his voice, he asked if she could lend him the amount he needed. Sunri smirked, amused by his request. She pointed out the irony of his situation. After telling his sister to return the advance she had taken, here he was, now asking for one himself. Kang recalled the president of the company warning him to be careful and not to lose himself, realizing that this must be what Wu Sunri had meant. The consequence of his risk option being elevated to 49% had manifested in a way that threatened his own sense of self. Suddenly, he heard a voice telling him to calm down. He immediately recognized it as Yuval's and wondered if he was losing his mind. But then he remembered the soul fragment he had received from his former client and thought that perhaps it was the cause of what he was hearing. Holding the item in his hands, he silently thanked Yuval for the gift. Now that he was calmer, he picked up his sword from the ground and prepared himself. He started thinking about his next move. At that moment, a system message appeared before his eyes. After triggering it for the third time, he finally understood how to activate notifications at will. The system informed him that his character's information would now be displayed. Strovan Pelos's status appeared before him. His occupation was listed as a peasant from a fallen noble family, unverified, with the nickname Black Dog of Eldom. The system also displayed his combat abilities, though one particular section remained locked due to his level being too low. He noticed that the character's details were now far more extensive, with many more abilities available. He also realized that his health was not only full, but had surpassed the normal limit. Both his HP and SP were abnormally high, likely due to the status effect caused by the client's rage over the murder of his family. Even the skill names reflected this intensity. He now had keen eyes, which allowed him to detect and recall objects, information analysis, which let him interpret an opponent's unexpected movements, and persuasive speech, which could hold the attention of others more effectively. Additionally, there was pain suppression, which allowed him to keep moving despite injuries. However, it also meant that dying at any moment was a real possibility. Lastly, he noticed a skill named Torture. Once a target was captured by the Black Dog, they could not die without his permission. Seeing this ability left him in shock. Comparing Strovan Pelos to Yuval Pion, he saw how vastly different they were. One was an assassin who walked the path of darkness, while the other was an orthodox knight who earned the trust of his companions. They were complete opposites. From this, Kang gained a deeper understanding of what kind of person Strovan was. He also realized that the company would not have assigned him useless skills, meaning that, at some point, he would have to torture someone if necessary. As he continued reviewing Strovan's memories, he saw the details of his client's vendetta. He had been assigned to seek revenge on those who had targeted his parents, but Kang had assumed this mission was about killing, not torture. Frustrated, he began questioning the nature of his work. Then, memories of his own struggles surfaced. The money being offered for the job, his accumulated debts, his sister's current situation, and the loan she had taken out. It all reminded him why he was doing this in the first place. Irritated by his lack of choices, he slammed his head against a tree, trying to strengthen his resolve. This was no time for weakness. He knew the reality of his family's situation, the terrible job his sister had taken just to pay off their debts. He needed to be ruthless, focusing only on what needed to be done. If killing was required, he would do it. His objective was vengeance, to show just how unjust this situation was and how much Strovan had suffered. His family had been slaughtered not because of Strovan himself, but because his enemies had chosen to target them instead. They had brutally murdered an elderly couple who could not fight back, driving his sister to despair. Regardless of the justification or reason, their actions had been cruel. As both a man and an older brother, Kang sympathized with Strovan. Now he understood what he had to do. To quiet his guilt and silence his doubts, he would complete this mission without hesitation. With his goal set, he moved forward. He estimated the distance to the city to be about 4 kilometers, meaning it would take roughly an hour on foot. However, he reminded himself that he was no longer Kang, he was Strovan now. With the character's abilities, he could cover distances far more efficiently. As he leaped forward, he was amazed by the unnatural lightness of his body. But then, as he reached a high point, he realized he needed to land properly. He had not calculated this beforehand and suddenly found himself in danger. His body crashed into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. However, he quickly stood up, feeling only mild discomfort. His durability was remarkable. It seemed that Stroven's superior physique allowed his movements to correct themselves naturally, as if guided by instinct. Kang marveled at how much stronger his client's body was. Stroven was from a noble family, but he had an undeniably rough past. His striking features and sharp presence made him seem like a prince, yet he had become an assassin. Intrigued, Kang accessed more of his memories, uncovering his tragic past. Stroven had grown up in the slums, forced to steal scraps of bread to survive. He had been taken in by a gang of thieves before eventually joining an assassin's guild. His life had been constantly tossed around, much like a ball in a game. Kang thought it was tragic, but at the same time, he acknowledged that he himself wasn't much different. He, too, was killing for money. He recalled Wu Sunri's explanation that contracts were based on mutual consent. Even the company couldn't operate without it. The first contract in human history, when Eve was tempted by the forbidden fruit, had been based on her own free will. In the same way, consent was crucial. A person had to agree of their own volition. Suddenly, a system message appeared, asking him a question. Do you consider yourself a person of value to your own life? He was taken aback by the sudden message and had no immediate answer. He suspected that there might be a loophole in the contract he had signed with Sui. If such a loophole existed, he might be able to renegotiate his contract from the ground up. The thought intrigued him. Was it possible for someone like him to challenge the system? Lost in his thoughts, he didn't realize how much time had passed. Looking up at the sky, he decided to set these concerns aside for now. It was too dangerous to let the company know he was questioning the contract. If they discovered that he was looking for loopholes, they would simply cover them up before he could act. Before anything else, he needed to secure his own soul, and that required money. Focusing on the mission again, he picked up his pace. As night fell, the moonlight illuminated his path. He arrived at his destination, where the bodies of the client's family had been stored. He intended to examine them, hoping to find clues that would lead him to those responsible. Activating his keen eyes ability, he scanned the area and found traces of movement near where the bodies were kept. They could belong to either an animal or a person. Nothing seemed particularly unusual at first. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, he realized something was off. The complete absence of sound. There wasn't a single noise from insects or other creatures. The sheer silence made him uneasy. Then, he heard something coming from the forest and managed to dodge at the last second as a projectile flew past him, striking a wall instead. More projectiles followed, but with his character's abilities, he evaded them skillfully. The objects appeared to be daggers, thrown repeatedly in his direction. However, from above, he had a better view of his attackers' positions and quickly realized that avoiding a fight would be impossible. Using a double jump, he closed the distance between himself and his enemy. As he landed, he was astonished that he had just executed such an ability. Preparing to counterattack, he observed the opponent and noted that they did not appear particularly threatening. Nevertheless, the attacker did not retreat. Instead, they introduced themselves as Kesha and claimed they hadn't realized they were attacking Stroven. The protagonist hesitated for a moment and lowered his weapon slightly. He asked what Kesha was doing there, as even the guild shouldn't know about this location. Before answering, Kesha requested that he lower his sword completely. With access to the character's memories, the protagonist recognized Kesha as a former companion of Stroven, someone who had dealt with the aftermath of his missions. They had worked together for several years and developed a strong bond. Kesha, relieved at not having been struck, reiterated that he was only there to help. The protagonist, however, remained distrustful. Kesha had no way of knowing the current situation, yet he had come to this place alone. Suspicious, the protagonist asked how he had learned about this location. Kesha explained that during the Baron Creighton mission, he had seen Stroven leave the same forest. Wounded, still wary, the protagonist asked how many others knew about this place. Kesha assured him that, as far as he knew, no one else from the guild was aware. He admitted that while they might be different people now, They were still similar in many ways. The protagonist then noticed dried blood and small cuts on Kesha's hands. He immediately asked if Kesha had handled the bodies of his parents. Kesha confirmed that he had, explaining that he assumed Strovan would not be in the right state of mind to do it himself. He also reminded him that he was a gravekeeper. Irritated, the protagonist demanded to know if Kesha had erased any evidence from the corpses. Kesha hesitated and broke into a nervous sweat. He pleaded with Strovan to stop accusing him, stating that even if someone hardened their heart like steel, it was nearly impossible to dissect the parents who had given them life. That was why he had decided to handle the bodies himself. However, he assured Strovan that he had taken pictures and documented the wounds. The protagonist felt a deep pain in his chest, likely the emotions of his client. He realized he had jumped to conclusions and thanked Kesha for his help. Kesha, relieved, commented that it seemed like Strovan was returning to his old self. In Strovan's memories, Kesha was not someone who hesitated or hid things, so the protagonist decided to place some trust in him. He acknowledged that constant suspicion wouldn't get him anywhere. He then asked for Kesha's help in his journey. Kesha, sensing his sincerity, agreed without hesitation, saying that he had long awaited this moment. He mentioned that he had tried to gather useful clues but had found little of value. However, he did reveal something important. The victims had been attacked with heavy iron weapons, specifically a blunt instrument. Based on the wounds, it was likely that a club had been used. The protagonist deduced that mercenaries typically favored axes rather than clubs. This meant the culprit was likely a knight or a soldier. Kesha added that he had spoken with an old homeless woman nearby, who had seen a troop of soldiers patrolling the area. Enraged, the protagonist questioned why a soldier would do such a thing. Kesha urged him to calm down, pointing out that his thirst for blood was becoming overwhelming. Kang realized that he needed to control himself. He could not let Strovan's emotions take over his own. To distance himself from the situation emotionally, he decided to approach the mission as if it were a game. He categorized missions into two types: search missions, which involved finding clues and solving problems for rewards, and hunt missions, which focused solely on eliminating targets. If he had to classify his past missions, the one with Yuval was a search mission since it involved gaining trust and uncovering secrets, whereas Parsons' mission had been a hunt mission, as it required slaughtering enemies on the battlefield. He then wondered what category his current mission fell under. Realizing that he had to eliminate a group of 15 soldiers, he concluded that this was a hunt mission. He asked Kesha if he could determine the soldiers' affiliations, to which Kesha replied that he had already done so. The protagonist was impressed by Kesha's efficiency. However, he was troubled when Kesha revealed the number of soldiers, realizing that he would have to take down all 15 of them. After leaving the burial site, they made their way toward the city. Kesha pointed out the soldiers responsible for patrolling, stating that these men were truly despicable. The protagonist learned that Strovan's parents were not their only victims. A new lord had been appointed in the city of Dud-Aim following a recent territorial war. As a result, public order had collapsed, and the city was in turmoil. To suppress the unrest, a man named Jerson had taken control, and over time, he had become the law. The city was now ruled by the cruelest and most notorious criminals of Eldom, who exploited their authority to commit murder, rape, theft, and other crimes, all under the pretense of maintaining order. These men were granted clemency for their atrocities from the rooftop. The protagonist observed the soldiers dragging an older man away while his daughter screamed for them to let him go. In a desperate act, she hurled a stone at one of the guards, striking him in the head. He looked at the girl, who insisted that they had stolen nothing. If punishment had to be dealt, she asked that it be given to her instead of her father. Sarcastically, the guard mocked her, saying she was a devoted daughter. The protagonist realized she was in serious danger, but before he could intervene, a spear struck her directly. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, ignoring his friend's worried shouts. The guards laughed at the situation, cruelly remarking that the girl's father would soon be joining her, so she wouldn't be alone for long. Unnoticed, the protagonist approached, but he had no intention of being subtle. The soldiers finally spotted him and demanded to know who he was. Instead of answering, he simply chuckled. Confused, one of the guards asked why he was laughing, while another scoffed, saying the man would sober up once he had a blade in his stomach. The guards moved to attack, ordering him not to move, but he only thanked them. He was grateful that they were truly despicable. One of the guards, angered by the insult, lunged at him. The protagonist remained still, unfazed. The guard laughed, calling him a reckless fool, and asked how it felt to be struck. However, when he looked at his sword, he realized it had been shattered. The guard stood in disbelief, his expression frozen. In the next moment, the protagonist kicked him back and, without hesitation, slashed through him with his sword, cutting him from top to bottom. The enemy had no time to react and collapsed beside a fellow guard. The remaining soldiers were stunned, fear creeping into their expressions. The protagonist glared at them with a fierce, almost insane look. But he wasn't the only one who seemed mad. The guards were whispering among themselves, wondering who he was. They quickly called for reinforcements. Kesha arrived at the scene, warning that more soldiers were on their way and urging them to retreat. However, the protagonist smiled, pleased that he wouldn't have to search for them himself. He surged forward instead, much to Kesha's alarm that he charged straight at the remaining guards. One tried to strike him, but he dodged effortlessly. In the next moment, he countered, slicing through the soldier's wrist and severing his hand. Without giving the others time to react, he continued his relentless assault, reveling in the bloodshed. The soldiers cursed him, calling him a demonic bastard, and prepared to attack all at once. Among them, the protagonist spotted a guard wielding a club. He allowed the soldier to attack first, anticipating his movements. However, just as the club was about to strike, the protagonist countered with a flurry of slashes, leaving the man mortally wounded. He called out to Kesha, instructing him not to let this one die just yet. Kesha moved in to deal with the restrained enemy while the protagonist turned his attention to the remaining guards. The soldiers glanced at each other, their confidence wavering. One of them muttered that reinforcements needed to arrive soon, while another admitted that the man before them was far too powerful. Realizing they had no chance, they attempted to flee. They weren't fast enough. The protagonist swiftly caught up to them. One soldier, who thought he had managed to escape, suddenly gasped as he felt cold steel pierce his back. He fell forward, lifeless, bodies littered the ground, all the guards dead, except for one. The last surviving soldier fell to his knees, begging for his life. The protagonist ordered him to stop. With cold precision, he drove his sword through the man's hand, pinning it to the ground. The soldier cried out in agony. The protagonist told him not to act human now, not to beg for mercy after all he had done. The guard, still pleading, insisted that he was telling the truth, claiming that he had done nothing wrong and that the others were responsible for the crimes. The protagonist ignored him, that he then asked if the soldier remembered. Confused, the man hesitated. The protagonist elaborated, asking if he recalled the people he had killed, the ones who had pleaded for mercy before he cut them down. Shaking, the soldier admitted that he did remember them all. The protagonist then issued a challenge. If the soldier could name the people he had murdered 3 days ago, he would spare his life. Terrified, the man stammered out 2 names: Emily Park and Dumais. The protagonist calmly stated that if the names were wrong, the soldier would die in the most brutal way imaginable. The guard, sweating profusely, insisted that he couldn't remember everyone, claiming that they were in a time of war. The protagonist had already expected that answer. The soldier suddenly let out a loud scream, an act of desperation meant to alert his reinforcements. Moments later, the remaining troops, having heard the distress call, stormed onto the scene. As they arrived, they took in the carnage, the bodies of their fallen comrades, and immediately recognized the threat. The reinforcements questioned if these 2 men had really taken down all of their allies alone. Realizing they were dealing with something unnatural, they launched a full attack. However, they too were swiftly eliminated. As night fell upon the city, the protagonist found himself washing away the blood. For a brief moment, a wave of nausea washed over him. He recalled the aftermath of his first mission with Parsons, where he had felt the same unease. But this time, it was worse. The battle with Parsons had been war. He had been forced to kill out of necessity. But this had been a massacre. That time, he had no choice. This time, he had wanted it. He had crushed his enemies, reveling in their screams. He had enjoyed it to silence his thoughts, He poured a bucket of cold water over his head. He admitted to himself that he had lost this battle, not against the soldiers but against himself. He should not have done what he did. He reminded himself that this was just a job, a task with a generous reward that would help his family. He repeated to himself that this was only a game. If he hadn't killed them, they would have killed him. Whether it was dying in that world or in reality, the result was the same. This mission had a high-risk option enabled, meaning that any injuries or death would apply to his real body as well. He might not even survive as himself if things went wrong. However, the reward was 40 million won, enough to help his family. The reward would be multiplied fivefold, and he wasn't even aiming for a perfect conclusion. He only wanted to finish the job. He thought back to his sister, who had taken an advance payment from the club, a private loan, just like in a third-rate movie. He could already see his family being destroyed, his sister being sold. Sacrificing oneself for others was what family did. His sister was innocent, too soft-hearted, and she should not be the one to suffer. If anyone tried to harm her, he swore he would kill them. His thoughts were interrupted by a system message. He had reached level 4. His compassion stat had increased, along with other attributes. He looked at the system notification, puzzled by what it meant. Then, a dark thought surfaced in his mind, one about murder. Immediately, he linked it to Strovan. His body suddenly burned with an intense heat, his heartbeat becoming erratic. The system alerted him that his health had reached a limit and that, to protect the player, the compassion state would be forcibly removed. The protagonist felt the unbearable rage vanish in an instant. He took a deep breath, relieved by the absence of the overwhelming burden. Then he laughed. Now, he finally understood what it meant to be merciful. The massacre had not been entirely of his own will. The moment he had gained compassion, his real consciousness had returned to his body. Those quick, brutal actions had been Strovan, not his. That meant he wasn't entirely responsible. He should have felt relieved. But instead, he screamed at himself to shut up. He refused to run from his responsibilities. He had sinned for the sake of money. He preferred to be condemned as a murderer rather than pretend it had not happened. Just as Yuval had maintained his pride until his last breath, this was his sin, the assassin's final innocence. Finally, the system notified him that the Bloody Avenger mission had been updated. The message about a secret Avenger unsettled him. The system notified that the completion of the revenge would be determined by Strovan's satisfaction, even displaying a satisfaction bar. Kang questioned the reasoning behind this since he had already killed and torn apart many people, yet the satisfaction meter was only half full. He couldn't understand why Strovan still thirsted for so much blood. He wondered what else he had to do. Should he kill more, or had he simply not done enough? Additionally, he had captured the guards who wielded clubs, intending to gather information or use them for something else. The protagonist had avoided thinking about this, but he could no longer ignore Strovan's other skill. Torture at a scene from the movie Law-Abiding Citizen came to mind, where the main character refused to give his family's murderer a quick death. Instead, he tortured him, cutting him apart piece by piece, and seemed to enjoy the suffering he inflicted. Satisfaction was the key. There was no other way. He had to use that same method. Late at night, Kang and Kesha arrived at their designated location. Kesha admitted that he had a hard time keeping the guards alive and questioned why Strovan insisted on it. Confused, Kang asked what he meant. Kesha pointed out that Strovan had cut their arteries as if he was impatient. The protagonist explained that he had been holding himself back. Kang checked Strovan's status and noticed that his health was dangerously low due to the battle earlier. The assassin's madness skill had been active. It drained HP and mana over time but significantly boosted his strength and other abilities. It was a double-edged sword, costing 5 HP per minute and capable of making him faint quickly if left unchecked. Inside a prison chamber, Kang asked about the condition of the prisoners. Kesha confirmed that they were still breathing, but wouldn't last much longer. The protagonist had to act fast. Kesha explained that he had knocked them out with anesthetics, but he was still hesitant about what came next. Regardless, he proceeded with the procedure, stating that anesthetics and narcotics used just below a lethal dose wouldn't be a problem. Even if the guard woke up, he would be too weak to resist. One of the captured guards slowly regained consciousness, confused about his surroundings. As his vision cleared, he recognized Stroven's face. Kang coldly confirmed the guard's identity, listing his name, age, and family details. Alan Fisk, 36 years old, originally from Stein, with a wife and 2 daughters living in Aldham. The man panicked, asking who Kang was and what he wanted. Instead of answering, Kang drove a dagger into the guard's leg. Alan flinched but didn't immediately feel pain. The protagonist explained that the pain would come slowly seconds later. Alan screamed in agony as the delayed effect kicked in. Kang continued his cruel monologue, revealing that the dagger was coated with an antidote and that the anesthesia had worn off. Then, he laid out the rules. Answer every question truthfully, and if he lies, he will be struck again. Alan immediately promised to comply, begging for mercy. Kang pulled out the dagger, and Kesha re-administered the anesthetic. The process would repeat until Alan was completely broken. Kang started the interrogation. The first step in torture was breaking the subject's mental barriers. Asking simple, rapid-fire questions forced the victim to answer without thinking, making them easier to manipulate. If the questions were threatening or involved the guard's family, Alan's fear would cloud his judgment, making him even more vulnerable. Alan pleaded, claiming that his family was innocent and that he deserved the punishment instead. Kang ignored his words. Instead, in a cold, metallic whisper, he threatened to personally kill Alan's entire family. The guard's desperation exploded. He begged for them to be spared. Kang knew that repeating terrifying words could induce a hypnotic state, especially when combined with extreme pain and drug-induced confusion. He intensified his threats, pushing the man's mind to the brink. The system acknowledged his actions, activating multiple abilities at once. Persuasion, speech, information analysis, enhanced vision. Due to the combined effects, the mental collapse buff was triggered, enhancing the interrogation. Kang escalated his psychological and physical intimidation, ensuring total mental domination over Alan. He wanted the guard to break down completely, drowning in despair, fear, and guilt. Soon, the torture worked. The system notified that Alan had completely surrendered. Torture was not just pain, it was control. When someone fully submits, they no longer see their captor as an enemy but as an absolute force to obey and beg for mercy. Kang stared at Alan, giving him one last chance to tell the truth. If he cooperated, his family would be spared. At that moment, Alan's survival depended entirely on Kang's mercy. The protagonist asked 3 questions: the names of his fellow soldiers and where their families lived. Alan confessed, listing locations. Teo's family lived behind a blacksmith shop in a village near Sisson Castle. Suk's family stayed in the guard barracks in the same village. Why had they destroyed the house near the river 3 days ago? Alan said it was because of a traitor. They had received an anonymous tip claiming that a target lived there. Who sent the information? Alan didn't know. He swore that a note had mysteriously appeared on their table overnight, as if a ghost had left it. Kesha found this strange, but Kang pushed the thought aside, focusing on freeing the prisoners first. Once freed, the captured guards turned on Alan. They blamed him for their suffering and vowed revenge. Kang found this ironic. It wasn't Alan who had massacred them, it had been himself. Yet, they saw Alan as the traitor and directed all their rage toward him. Before leaving, Kang asked Alan one final question. Alan hesitated, confused. Kang then mocked his naivety, questioning if he had truly believed that his family would be spared. Before Alan could react, his former comrades descended upon him. They ripped him apart, slicing him to pieces in the most gruesome death imaginable. His final moments were filled with screams of agony. Kang left the scene and called for Kesha. Kesha asked if he was certain about his decision. Kang responded that he had no intention of harming Alan's family. He had only said that to torment him further before his death. However, Kesha's real concern wasn't Alan. It was the guild. Kang had no definitive answer for that yet. Memories of Stroven resurfaced. The Black Hound of Eldam, a deadly human weapon molded by the Assassin's Guild. Within the guild, one man had shown him kindness, teaching him valuable skills. This man, the guild master, was like a father to Stroven. More than anyone, he was a master of moving in and out of places undetected. While leaving notes on the table, Kesha expressed confusion about why the master had done something so obvious. He believed the master must have known that his actions could be easily discovered. The protagonist concluded that this meant the master didn't care whether someone found out or not. Kesha questioned what that meant, but the protagonist stated that it wasn't something he needed to know. He then asked Kesha what he planned to do next. Looking at him, Kang thought about how round-faced and naive Kesha seemed, despite being an assassin. However, he wasn't at the top of the ranking. The protagonist stated that Kesha was still human, and if he wanted to leave the guild, he should do so now. Before his hands became even more stained with blood, Kesha asked if the guild would really just stand by and watch him leave. Kang assured him that if anyone from the guild tried to hunt him down, he would personally exterminate the entire organization. Kesha, after some hesitation, admitted that it was possible for Kang's group to do that. He then mentioned that the master's words might have been correct after all. Curious, Kang asked what words Kesha was referring to. Kesha recalled that the master had once told Strovan that his family was an obstacle and that if they disappeared, Strovan wouldn't just be feared in Eldom, but he would become the greatest assassin in all of Tailroad. Kang asked why, but Kesha seemed confused by the question. The protagonist, however, understood that Kesha truly needed to get away from all of this. He urged him to take his family and leave the city at night before things got even worse. That night, Kang noticed that Strovan's satisfaction had significantly increased, climbing by 30% during Aldine's torture and as he screamed in pain. This confirmed to Kang that he needed to continue this path. Kesha interrupted his thoughts for a moment, asking what Kang planned to do next. He acknowledged that while their work required bloodshed, neither of them had ever done it because they truly wanted to. Instead of answering directly, Kang simply told Kesha to survive. He was free to live however he wished from now on. He warned him, however, not to lose himself like Kang had. Unlike a beast, Kesha could still live as a human, even if his soul had already been sold. After their farewell, the protagonist headed to Eldom's slums. Upon arriving, he found himself in a narrow alleyway, so damp and barren that even the desperate avoided it. The silence and the absence of people made him immediately realize that they were hiding. Raising his voice, Kang introduced himself, declaring that he was the Black Hound and that he had come to see the master, thanks to his heightened senses. He quickly spotted 2 figures behind the debris and 3 more near the alley's entrance. His instincts had become as sharp as an animal's, allowing him to detect movement, sense, and even hidden breathing patterns. Suddenly, a guild member stepped forward, blocking his path. He recognized the man Zyrtec, the guild's third in command and Strovan's direct superior. However, this time was different. Kang could sense everything about him. His breathing, his subtle movements, and even his hesitation as he reached for a hidden blade under his sleeve. Despite his higher rank, Zyrtec respected Strovan.to assassins. Ranks were determined by skill, not by honor or hierarchy. Strength was everything. Kang warned Zyrtec that he was there to challenge the master, and that if he understood the guild's law, he should stay out of the way. Power was the only true rule in this world. Zyrtec was about to respond, but a voice interrupted them. The Black Hound has finally appeared. Zyrtec immediately recognized the voice. It was the master. Kang acknowledged him but mocked his skills, saying that if he had truly reached the pinnacle, he should have been able to sense him before he spoke. The master laughed, understanding that Strovan had finally made his decision. This man was the head of Eldom's largest assassin guild. The system activated the assimilation process. An alert appeared, warning that due to the intense emotional state, the extreme rage buff had been triggered, along with the bloodlust madness effect. The master observed him carefully with a burning glare. He remarked that Strovan had finally broken past his limit, making him worthy of facing him in battle as flames reflected in his eyes. He invited Strovan to attack, taunting him by asking if he would rather be the hunted instead. Kang, however, needed to confirm one thing first. He demanded to know if the master was truly responsible for his family's death. The master responded bluntly, the guards had carried it out. Hearing this, Kang expressed his disappointment, accusing the master of acting ignorant at such a crucial moment. He mocked him, suggesting that he was afraid that he knew that if he provoked the master, it would force him into action in a battle to the death. Hesitation meant defeat. If Kang wanted to kill without remorse, he needed to hear it from the master himself. The master sighed, asking if this was truly Strovan before him. He noted how his former student had suddenly become reliant on words instead of action. Still, he agreed to answer. He admitted that he had indeed left the note for the guards. Then, he asked if Strovan was satisfied. Kang simply replied, "Thank you." His guilt disappeared completely. The system confirmed that the mission was progressing and full assimilation had begun. A wave of memories surged through Kang's mind. The final moments of Strovan's past resurfaced, fueling an unstoppable rage. His heart no longer beat from anger. It had become completely still. Ignoring the searing pain in his muscles, he activated a new ability. His blood vessels constricted, making his body feel as cold as ice. His blood flow accelerated, delivering oxygen to every muscle. The world around him slowed down, and his entire body trembled. The system activated Fatal Strike. The stacking effects of his buffs made him feel unstoppable. He moved in an instant. The master couldn't react. He had underestimated Kang's speed. Before he could counter, the protagonist was already upon him, striking like a phantom assassin. The master barely had time to think. His body froze in disbelief. Kang had already slashed him once. Not enough to kill, but enough to halt his movement. But he wasn't finished yet. Before the master could recover, Kang unleashed a flurry of strikes, slicing through him from multiple directions. There was no time to react. The master staggered back, feeling his limbs go numb. His expression shifted, a mix of shock and realization. He could no longer feel parts of his body. His legs buckled. His arms dangled uselessly, his vision blurred. The guild master collapsed, completely dismembered. The starry sky illuminated the darkness of the night. The protagonist, believing that everything was finally over, checked the satisfaction level. However, to his shock, it was still only at 2%. Even while collapsed on the ground, the master of assassins smiled, confirming that Strovan was exactly as he had expected. He claimed that his eyes had not deceived him. Strovan possessed a unique talent and was walking the path of a king. The protagonist asked what that meant. The master laughed, explaining that the king of assassins, the Lord of Shadows, had finally emerged, and the world would soon tremble in fear. The embodiment of death had appeared. This left the protagonist confused. He couldn't understand why the master was laughing in this situation. The master answered, saying that he had every reason to be happy. He had waited patiently for so long, working tirelessly to make this moment a reality. Now, the king he had been waiting for had finally been born. The protagonist couldn't believe what he was hearing. He thought that such things only happened in fairy tales. Strovan had been deliberately shaped for this very moment. Now, the master of assassins would mold him into a perfect, deadly weapon. The master continued, explaining that he himself had never been greedy. Even if he had owned all the wealth in the region, he would have converted it into benefits for his family. The protagonist found himself agreeing to an extent. For the master, it was obvious. Strovan's true value was far greater than material wealth, that he claimed that Strovan was trying to protect what was precious to him, but he, as a mentor, had done what was necessary to complete him. The protagonist called the master insane. Surprisingly, the master agreed, admitting that he could never have dreamed of something so grand if he weren't crazy. But now, the results were undeniable. He had destroyed Strovan's family, his normal life, and his happiness, and as a result, Strovan had awakened. The protagonist refused to accept the master's words, calling them nonsense. The master explained further. Strovan was an assassin, earning money through bloodshed, using dirty money to support his family. However, because of his personality, he had never sought wealth or fame. At times, he doubted himself. A blade does not care for the blood it spills. The only effect blood has on a sword is rust, and in the end, it was Strovan himself who had killed his family. For the master, Strovan's family had been an obstacle to by removing them. He had allowed Strovan to reach his full potential. This was the master's way of showing kindness. The protagonist felt sick just imagining it. The idea of a king of assassins meant nothing to him. Perhaps to others it was an honor, but for him and Strovan it was meaningless. He declared that he would never fulfill the master's expectations. The master only smiled, saying that it didn't matter. He had already sent a message to every assassin in the territory, proclaiming that the king of assassins had been born. If that was true, the protagonist could already picture what would happen next. Like moths drawn to a flame, every assassin in the land would come after Strovan. And if he defeated them all, he would involuntarily become king. The protagonist demanded to know why the master had done all of this. The master answered calmly. He had already explained before that it was his dream. The history of assassination was long. They had been used by wealthy merchants, nobles, and even kings. Yet, they had always been treated like dirty rats. But there were kings for knights and nobles, so why shouldn't assassins have a king of their own? A supreme assassin whose very existence would make emperors tremble. The master had seen the potential in Strovan. A professional, with extraordinary skill and talent, but he lacked greed, even with his overwhelming ability. Stroven had only sought money to support his family. That a lack of greed was good, but too much of it was dangerous. If his family was a weakness, then removing them would make him stronger. The master had gambled everything on that belief, and the result was clear. He had been right. Now, as he lay dying, he regretted nothing. He simply asked Stroven to finish the job and move on. The protagonist finally understood he could respect people who chased their dreams, even if it cost them their lives. But the master was so utterly delusional that it disgusted him. This was his ultimate masterpiece. The master had spent his entire life molding Stroven into a weapon. Revenge and death were meaningless to him, because even in death, this masterpiece would be completed. Like the final brushstroke on a grand painting, Stroven's death would be the master's ultimate work of art. But the protagonist had already decided that he would destroy that dream. Instead of becoming the final brushstroke, he would ruin the entire painting. That he asked the master, could an assassin without a hand become the king of assassins? And then, without hesitation, he sliced off his own left hand. The master's face twisted in horror. Next, the protagonist cut off both of his own legs. The master screamed in desperation, begging him to stop. But the protagonist ignored him. That he severed both of his ears, then his left eye, and finally he placed the blade against his throat as he prepared to end it all. He told the master that he refused to become the monster he had envisioned, that he would die as a human. With that, he slit his own throat. It was Stroven's final act. The master collapsed in sheer despair. Even as Stroven lay dying, it was the master who perished first, not from his wounds, but from the shock. Seeing his life's work crumble before his eyes was more than he could bear. The satisfaction meter finally exceeded the threshold. Stroven's revenge was complete. As he returned to his real body, the protagonist asked if Stroven was finally satisfied. That he saw Stroven's spirit before him. The assassin looked pale, much older than before. His expression was unreadable. Many years had passed since the mission had been completed. Stroven confirmed that it was finished. Without a doubt, he had chosen to harm himself, and it had been a life-threatening adventure. But at some point, he began to feel something different. Even after killing himself, that should have only happened after the mission was complete. The protagonist realized how dangerous it had been. Stroven thanked him, stating that he had killed the master, but he had failed to truly complete his revenge against him. As the master had said, he had become the king of assassins, and now all the underground houses were under his command. Maybe he had been afraid of death after all. However, the protagonist countered that he was not afraid to die. He had lost everything and had no strength left. Because of that, he couldn't think nor act. It had been a massive loss, and he had been unable to do anything about it. In the end, he had avenged himself against the master, but he had also lost all purpose in life, making it meaningless. Stroven asked if the protagonist felt sorry for him, saying that he was praising him too much. He saw himself as nothing more than an animal. But the protagonist responded that he didn't feel sorry for him. He simply understood the pain of never seeing his family smile again. 3 years ago, he had felt the same way. He told Stroven that, in his place, he would have ended up the same way. The only reason he had completed the mission was that he still had a family. Stroven noted that the protagonist had never killed anyone, but he still understood the king of assassins. That realization felt strange to him. After that, Stroven led him to a cemetery. In front of them were 3 graves. Stroven stated that these were his family's tombs. The protagonist asked if this was his reward. Stroven, unfazed, asked if it was too much. Frustrated, the protagonist questioned Stroven's way of thinking. It was so different from Yuval, who, in the end, walked through golden fields with his family. Even though it was a lie, he had at least found peace in a dream. So why was Stroven's family still dead? Stroven replied that he already knew the answer. The protagonist then mentioned the consequences. Stroven, the king of assassins, had likely killed thousands and made countless families suffer. He had become too cruel of an aggressor to be seen as a victim. Stroven blamed himself. He believed that happiness with his family was a luxury he did not deserve. He couldn't wish for it. He could only feel sorrow, angered. The protagonist demanded to know why Stroven thought that way. He called this his reward, a dream he could never have, a life where he was denied everything he wanted. He asked why Strovan couldn't desire a happy life, living in a palace with his family. Was it because he had killed too many people? When his conscience was fragile, had he really not wanted to kill? Strovan simply thanked him. Kang said that he had never lived like Strovan, but that was exactly why Strovan had chosen him. He told the protagonist that he would now give him his power. He urged him to take it. Kang knew that Strovan had power feared by all and had experienced immense tragedy. He felt pity for Strovan but did not want to be involved with him. Strovan told him that he hoped the protagonist would never need to use his power, but he couldn't predict the future. Kang's life had already been difficult, and he did not know what disaster might befall him in the future. That was why he wanted to help. Finally, he urged Kang to protect his family and everything precious to him. That way, he could remain human until the very end, even after selling his soul. With that, the teleportation process began, returning Kang to his original dimension. When Kang opened his eyes, he realized he was back in his bedroom. Surprised, he looked around. Before, he had been in the company's office, and from there, he had been sent to the mission. Why had he returned directly home instead? A voice in his head informed him that there was no time to waste. It got straight to the point. Something urgent was happening at his house. That was why he had been sent there immediately. Kang panicked and asked what was going on. But the voice insisted there was no time to explain. He had to go right now. Without hesitation, Kang rushed out of his room. When he reached the living room, he saw several men dragging his sister away. Both his sister and the intruders were shocked to see him there. Instinctively, Kang ran toward her. The desperation on her face was obvious. He grabbed her arm and demanded to know who these men were. One of them scolded his sister, saying that she had claimed no one else was home, but they would deal with that later. One of the men questioned Kang, asking if he was the brother of Kang Yuval. Instead of answering, Kang demanded to know who they were. The man smirked, realizing it was their first time meeting. He tossed a business card in Kang's direction. Upon reading it, Kang froze. The card belonged to Bon Chun. Kang immediately realized who they were. They were from the Sonin Corporation, and they were trying to take his sister away. Kang, his voice sharp with suspicion, asked why people from the Sonin Corporation were in his house and why they were taking his sister. Bon Chun responded calmly, saying that his sister had serious financial problems. She had agreed to work for them and had even received an advance payment. However, she had failed to show up for work, and now, that had created a problem. Kang felt chills. The man spoke slowly and politely, making it even more unsettling. This wasn't just a neighborhood thug. This was a real gangster. Bon Chun then asked if Kang even knew what his sister had been up to. Kang admitted that he had only found out the previous day. Bon Chun simply replied that he would get straight to the point. She had taken an advance payment of 30 million won, but then quit. That had inconvenienced them. He added that he had never seen Cho Min-soo act this way before, but he had befriended a new worker, which was why they wanted her back. Kang wanted to clarify the situation. So he stated that his sister had borrowed money from the nightclub and that all she had to do was repay the debt. Bon Chun laughed as he asked who would pay it back for her. Her brother? After all, Kang didn't even have a job. Then, he threw a document on the floor. Kang picked it up and read the contract. His sister had signed away her rights over her own body. His sister admitted it couldn't be avoided. She had been scared. Kang felt sick. He could imagine what had happened. They had likely sweet-talked her first, then threatened her later. Even though it shocked him, Kang remained firm. He told them that the contract didn't matter. Unless it was a promissory note, it was just a piece of paper. The man smirked, saying that it was concerning. It seemed like her brother knew a lot about the law. Kang confirmed that he had studied law in university, but he still wasn't an expert. Bon Chun chuckled. He asked Kang if he would repay his sister's debt immediately. If so, he should speak politely and stop causing trouble. Another thug in the group laughed, sneering that Kang didn't even know if he'd survive the night. Kang glared at him. He could feel his anger rising. The man smirked. Did Kang want to hit him? The thug became furious and immediately insulted the protagonist before punching him in the face, demanding that he repeat what he had said and die. The verbal abuse didn't stop. He was clearly humiliated. Finally, he sneered that Kang's sister didn't belong in a nightclub and that instead, she should be sold off to some remote island. The moment Kang heard that, something inside him snapped and an overwhelming killing intent took over him. He repeated the thug's words, as if daring him to say them again. The thug was stunned. Kang realized that, in his current state, he wouldn't be able to win in a direct fight. But if he could recall Strovin's memories, he could use them to his advantage with that. Kang swiftly overpowered the thug and slammed him face first into the ground. Looking around, he saw his sister standing in shock at what she had just witnessed. Even the leader of the group looked surprised at his sudden outburst. After knocking down the thug, Kang was immediately threatened by the rest of the gang. They didn't like that he had struck one of their own. Kang, however, wanted to avoid escalating the fight. He pointed out that they had both hit each other, meaning he had only acted in self-defense, that he knew that talking wouldn't work, but he needed to buy time. He argued that nothing illegal had happened and even challenged them to call the police if they disagreed. One of the gang members laughed at the idea, saying that they didn't care who hit who. What mattered was that Kang had dared to touch their brother. Kang understood the situation perfectly. This was just as Strovin had warned him. He didn't want to use his power, but now, he was out of options. His rage had reached its peak. He wanted to kill these men for hurting his family. It didn't matter who they were or how many there were. The leader of the gang, Bon Chun, instructed Yura, one of his men, to pick up the unconscious thug. Yura hesitated, expecting a different order, but Bon Chun repeated himself in a firm tone. Yura quickly obeyed. Bon Chun then turned his attention back to Kang. He remarked that the information they had about him seemed to be lacking. Kang was nothing like they had heard. Kang, however, was no longer paying attention. His mind was somewhere else, entirely focused on his next move. He analyzed the situation. All of them were big and strong. One hit from them could break him. He believed he stood a chance if he used Strovin's powers. However, he wasn't sure if his body could handle it. His confidence wavered for a moment, but he still wanted to to his surprise. The gang leader suddenly changed his tone. He dropped the hostility and said he wanted to have a friendly conversation. Just like Kang had suggested earlier, Kang was shocked by the sudden shift. Bon Chun had noticed something in Kang's eyes, a killer's intent. He admitted that he could recognize people like him just from their gaze. He knew Kang had killed before. Not just once or twice, but many times. Bon Chun explained that he always needed his men to be in top condition. If they got injured or ended up somewhere useless, he couldn't conduct business, so he proposed a deal. They would settle the debt. The cost of sending 4 men to collect Kang's sister, combined with a cancellation fee, totaled 10 million won. Added to the 30 million she originally owed, the final price was 40 million won. Bon Chun then gave Kang a deadline. He had until the next day to pay it. If he couldn't pay, then there would be no further discussion. Kang, however, didn't hesitate. That he calmly stated that there was no need to wait. He would settle it right now. Taking out his phone, Kang made a call. On the other end, Wu Sunri answered. Kang asked if she was aware of his current situation. She confirmed that she was. Before Kang could even tell her where to send the money, Sunri interrupted him. She already knew the account details. She assured him that it was already taken care of. He could check now. The speed at which it was handled shocked Kang. Bon Chun, noticing his reaction, asked if something had gone wrong. Kang calmly denied it. He stated that the payment had already been made. Bon Chun's men, skeptical, asked their boss to confirm it. After checking, Bon Chun nodded. He then looked at Kang with a newfound respect. He remarked that Kang was quite talented. He had managed to pay 40 million won instantly. His instincts had been correct. Kang wasn't normal. With that, Bon Chun and his men left as soon as the door closed behind them. Kang collapsed onto the floor. He was still not used to these kinds of situations. Regaining his composure, he checked on his sister. He told her to never get involved with those men again. They were extremely dangerous. His sister, still shaken, promised that she wouldn't. Kang then gave her strict instructions. She was to avoid going near that place. If she ever saw those men again, she was to run to a crowded area. He also revealed that he had installed a tracking app on her phone. Additionally, he advised her to buy a can of pepper spray and a GPS alarm that could be activated with a single press. His sister was overwhelmed. She tried to calm him down, saying that the worst had already passed. She reassured him that she wouldn't leave the house for a long time. She asked if that was enough to ease his worry. Kang agreed, but now, his sister had a question for him. She pointed out that they had gotten the money and that it was great, but she wanted to know where he had gotten 40 million won. Kang simply responded that he had promised he would get it. Deep down, though, he knew what he had done to earn it. He had sworn to protect his family, even if it meant selling his soul, and now, he had kept that promise. But his sister wasn't satisfied with that answer. She kept pressing him for an explanation. Kang, feeling uneasy, tried to dodge the question. His sister, however, wasn't convinced. She guessed that it must have been a bank loan, but she knew his financial situation. There was no way a bank would lend him that kind of money, which meant there was only one other possibility. She concluded that he must have borrowed it from a private lender. The protagonist knew that his sister's assumption was incorrect, but he couldn't explain where the money had really come from. Internally, he pleaded with all the deities to help him get through this situation. Then, Wu Sunri contacted him, offering a solution. She suggested that he tell his sister that he wasn't unemployed, and that one of their company's employees would come to his house to explain things. Kang agreed and tried to stall for time until the company's employee arrived. Shortly after, the doorbell rang. His sister, still on edge from the previous night's events, immediately panicked, fearing that the gangsters had returned. However, a voice called out to Kang by name, asking if he was home. When Kang opened the door, Hyung Jum was standing there. Hyung Jum greeted Kang, saying it had been a long time since they last met. Kang immediately realized that he was acting, so he decided to play along. Hyung Jum apologized for dropping by unannounced, calling it rude behavior. His sister was suspicious. Since when had Kang had such a polite and well-mannered friend? Despite her doubts, she welcomed him inside. She then offered to prepare coffee for their guest, giving the two men a moment alone. As soon as she was out of earshot, Kang lowered his voice and asked what the hell Hyung Jum was doing. Hyung Jum smirked and told him to just go along with it. He would handle the rest. When his sister returned with the coffee, Hyung Jum formally introduced himself. He claimed that he had met Kang while living in the city and that they had started a business together. His sister was surprised but pleased, which annoyed Kang. She questioned why his friend was a successful businessman, while Kang was still a jobless loser. If they were really close, why hadn't Kang followed his friend's lead? Hyung Jum laughed and clarified that he wasn't the owner, just a co-founder. He handled the company's finances and distribution. His sister was even more confused. If Hyung Jum wasn't the one who came up with the idea, who was the real mastermind behind it? Hyung Jum looked directly at Kang and casually replied, "It was his idea." Even Kang was shocked by the bold-faced lie. Now, he was stuck with the story of a fake business that he had supposedly founded. His sister, however, struggled to believe it. She asked if this was some kind of prank or if Kang had really been this amazing all along. Kang was offended that his sister had so little faith in him. Meanwhile, Hyung Jum continued the charade, confidently claiming that Kang was incredibly skilled and that he earned a lot of money. His sister remained skeptical. She narrowed her eyes at Kang, clearly doubting his abilities. Teo reinforced the lie. Hyung Jum suggested that Kang had simply never told his family about his success. Kang, playing along, pretended that he had always planned to tell them eventually but hadn't found the right time. Hyung Jum explained that their company made good money and that there was nothing illegal about it. Instead, they produced a popular product that sold well. He encouraged Kang to be proud of his achievements rather than hiding them. Kang had no idea where Hyung Jum was going with this story, that he knew that his friend was improvising, but he was completely in the dark about what kind of company he was supposedly running. His sister was still skeptical. The story didn't add up. If Kang was so successful, why had he been so depressed and acting like a complete failure? Hyung Jum quickly improvised again. He suggested that Kang was only acting that way because he had been working so hard and was finally in a comfortable position. People who don't have money act like they do. But those who actually have money, they don't need to act like they do. Kang, realizing the lie wasn't working, braced himself for his sister's reaction. However, to his surprise, she accepted the explanation. Hyung Jum added that they had only recently paid off their initial investment, which was why the business had only become truly profitable this year. He explained that Kang had been too focused on managing the company to discuss it with his family. His sister nodded slowly, finding the explanation plausible. But then, she asked why Kang was revealing all of this now. Hyung Jum sighed and admitted that it was because of her situation. She suddenly felt embarrassed, but he reassured her that Kang considered him family, so that extended to her as well. He also claimed that Kang had been hesitant to talk about their business because of the nature of their product. That statement alarmed her. She demanded to know what kind of business they were running. Hyung Jum hesitated. Even he seemed embarrassed. He admitted that their company manufactured toys. Seeing her confusion, He added that their business had low production costs but high sales prices, which made it very profitable. Her brows furrowed as she studied the business card Hyung Jum handed her. She saw the name of the company but still didn't understand completely. She then asked if it was a luxury brand. Hyung Jum hesitated before answering. Her eyes suddenly widened as realization dawned. She stared at the business card again, her face turning pale. She slowly asked if the company was what she thought it was. Hyung Jum shrugged. I'm not sure what you're thinking, but if it's what I think you're thinking, then yeah. Kang, realizing what was happening, panicked and grabbed her arm, trying to calm her down. But she simply sighed and said that she finally understood. She looked at him in disgust, as if he were a cockroach. She accused him of earning millions and keeping it a secret. Now, everything made sense. She finally understood why he couldn't get a normal job or why he stayed home all the time. She admitted that she could accept that he had been hiding it, but she wanted nothing to do with it. She didn't want to be associated with a pervert. With that, she stormed into her room and locked the door. Kang was horrified. He turned to Hyung Jum, furious. He swore that he would make him pay for this. The next day, Kang headed to the company's headquarters. The receptionist greeted him warmly, commenting that he looked happy. She asked what had happened. Kang simply replied that everything was fine. Despite the disaster from the previous day, his family's attitude toward him had changed. Previously, they had looked at him like a pathetic bum. Now, he was seen as the founder of a shameful yet successful business. He had told them he'd be busy for a while and explained that the company was still struggling financially. Hence, he couldn't help with money just yet, but he reassured them that one day, no matter what it took, he would make their home better. For now, that was his goal. As he walked toward the office, Woo Sunri appeared. She smiled, commenting that his work had gone well and that she was glad to see him in good condition. She admitted that she had been worried, thinking she had given him too extreme of a mission. Kang dismissed the concern, saying it was nothing too serious. However, Sunri corrected him. She wasn't referring to his sister. She meant the Strovan mission. Kang had completely forgotten about it. The moment he remembered, his head throbbed that he had killed so many people and still managed to forget. For the first time, he realized just how far he had gone. Kang was beginning to feel angry. Woo Sunri pointed out that he was too weak when it came to bloodshed and murder. She explained that highly ethical people often had strong talents, but if they couldn't fully utilize them, they would only be useful for certain types of missions. Kang reluctantly agreed with her. He knew that most clients who hired the company were driven to desperation, whether through revenge, assassination, or massacre. Unlike his previous mission with Yuval, many could not complete their missions without taking a life. He also realized that Woo Sunri was deliberately pushing him toward this mission, almost as if she were betting on him. This frustrated him, but he accepted the reality. He promised himself that if there was bloodshed, he would be the only one responsible for it. Kang held onto the last innocence of a killer, yet he refused to be a coward who avoided responsibility. He acknowledged that the money he was using to protect his family came from taking lives, and he had to accept it. In that sense, he truly was no different from a mercenary. Woo Sunri noted that he had decided to become strong, and that a beautiful light surrounded him. Kang didn't understand what she meant and asked if she could see his soul, beyond just reading his thoughts. She promised to explain later. Right now, a client was waiting for him. After entering the mission room, Kang immediately noticed how spacious it was and questioned if it was some kind of spatial distortion. Woo Sunri only smirked, saying he was a fantasy enthusiast for recognizing it so quickly. Then, she gave a direct command. A portal opened beneath him. Kang, shocked, asked if she was a mage, capable of casting such a spell. She dismissed the idea, explaining that while it looked like magic, it was something different. However, she couldn't explain the details yet. His level wasn't high enough to understand. She then introduced his next mission. Kang would be starting a long-term assignment for the first time. The refuge system would protect his real body, as he would remain inside the mission world for an extended period. The difficulty level was only 8, but the bonus payout was 350 million won. She explained that, if he accepted the risk, he could receive up to 170 million. Kang was confused. Previously, she had told him that missions paying over 1 billion won were ranked A. Woo Sunri clarified that he had been personally chosen for this mission. The client, Sane had specifically requested someone with Kang's exact characteristics. Kang immediately thought of his Parsons mission. Back then, there had been special conditions, including a theft objective, which allowed him to earn nearly 100 million won. However, because of the percentage-based payout, he had only received 1 million. Now, the risk level for this mission was at 30%, but Kang insisted on keeping it that way. This was his first long-term mission, and he wanted to play it safe. The greatest danger was experiencing another mental fusion with the client, something he never wanted to go through again. Kang was transported into his new client's body. As soon as he arrived, he felt an intense heat surrounding him. He was standing atop the walls of a fortress, overlooking the scorched landscape beyond. Focusing his mind, he prepared himself and immediately felt the emotions of Kessin. His new client, flowing into him, the memories of Kessin surfaced. He had once stood before his lord, reporting that their scouts had encountered an unexpectedly massive horde of orcs. The situation was far more dire than anticipated. If this continued, the entire city would be in grave danger. Outside, the entire city was in motion, yet everything felt eerily silent. Back in his memories, the Lord responded with despair. The king had vanished, taking with him all the soldiers and the city's tax funds. The vaults were empty, and the real question now wasn't how to fight the orcs, but whether they would starve to death first. Kang, watching through Kessin's eyes, felt his frustration. The Lord had abandoned them all. He wasn't a leader, but a man simply trying to survive on his own while leaving the people to be slaughtered by orcs. Kessin was disgusted. He questioned how a man like this had ever become Lord. Back in the present, Kang processed everything he had just learned. Kessin was a just man, carrying an overwhelming burden, far heavier than Yuval's had ever been. His city was surrounded by monsters, with no food, no soldiers, and no way out. People were turning on each other, attacking their own neighbors in desperation. The guards were overwhelmed, struggling to keep the city from collapsing into chaos. Kang then witnessed a horrifying memory. Gauss, another city official, approached Kessin, informing him of something truly disturbing. Some of the citizens had begun boiling human bones to make soup. Desperate cannibalism had already begun. Gauss was desperate, knowing that if this continued, the citizens would kill each other before the orcs even arrived. Kessin had no choice. He executed those who had lost their sanity, but the horror continued. He then found a starving child, crying out in pain, and a woman boiling her neighbor's child for food. Kessin had to kill her, even though she barely had the strength to lift a knife. Kang was horrified. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something anyone should have to experience. His hands trembled as he looked over the city walls. This was the opposite of his Parsons mission. Instead of leading an attack, he was now defending a dying city. But the truth was brutal. The battle had already been lost. There were no supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope. The orcs had surrounded them, and the soldiers who remained were looting civilian homes in desperation. Kang felt overwhelmed. How was he supposed to fix all of this? The system updated the mission. A new primary objective appeared: resolve the city's starvation crisis and maintain order. Several secondary missions were also added Kang's side. This was way beyond what he expected, but he knew there had to be a way out. Thinking coldly and logically, he analyzed the situation. Kessin was a knight, he had loyal guards, and his strength alone was a valuable asset. If they could secure a trade route, they might be able to bring in supplies and reconnect with other cities. That was their best chance, and Kang knew he would have to act fast. Kang remembered that there was no money left, and the Lord had taken all the soldiers, weapons, horses, and remaining funds. This meant that, even if he managed to secure the trade route, he wouldn't be able to do anything. The mission felt impossible, and he couldn't imagine how much harder a rank a mission would be. Suddenly, he was interrupted. A guard rushed toward him, reporting a disturbance in the main village. The system immediately alerted him about an incident inside the castle as well. Kang didn't have time to think. He knew that seeing the situation firsthand might help him find answers, so he ran toward the disturbance. As he approached the scene, the situation became clear. There was a commotion between civilians and guards. People were robbing each other in broad daylight, while the guards stood idly by. Everyone was starving, and it was clear that no one cared about laws anymore. Kang activated his special ability, coercion, and gave a strict order. Everyone froze in place, that he commanded the guards to arrest everyone involved, allowing them to kill any who resisted. The guards, following his authority, began to detain the looters. While this would temporarily restore order, Kang doubted whether it was a long-term solution. Before he could plan his next move, someone approached him. Kang immediately recognized Buru, a mercenary who was like a brother to his client, Kessin. The two had chosen different paths. One became a knight, the other a mercenary, but their bond remained. However, Kang also knew that Buru worked for Shuzketel, the brother of Lord Gauss. This made things even more complicated. Buru, unfazed by the situation, asked if Kessin was planning to kill him. Kang knew that, despite their brotherly bond, Buru was still a dangerous figure. His employer, Shuz, was trying to claim power, and any misstep here could jeopardize the mission. Kang quickly took control of the conversation, accusing Buru of causing the disturbance. Buru denied any wrongdoing and pointed at a terrified woman, claiming that she owed him money. The woman, on the verge of tears, denied his accusations, stating that she had already repaid Lord Gauss. Buru challenged her, demanding proof. However, the woman had no receipt to confirm her payment. Smirking, Buru revealed a promissory note, claiming that by law, he had the right to confiscate her belongings. He then turned to Kang, tauntingly asking what should be done. Should he arrest the woman for non-payment? Kang grimly assessed the situation. The woman was clearly the victim, yet by law, Buru had the right to demand payment. The reality was that she had already paid the Lord, but the Lord had run off with the money. Now, Buru was forcing her to pay again. Frustrated by the injustice of the situation, Kang ordered both sides to remain silent. He then declared that all disputed goods would be confiscated. Both the woman and Buru were shocked by the decision. Buru protested, arguing that Shuz was the rightful heir to Lord Gauss, so the money belonged to him. However, Kang pointed out that the promissory note was signed by Gauss-Ketel, not Shuz. This meant that, by law, Shuz had no claim to the debt. Buru attempted another defense, claiming that Shuz was Gauss's brother, but Kang dismissed that argument as irrelevant. Legally, Shuz was just another noble, not the recognized ruler of the city. Until Gauss was officially declared dead, the true lord remained Gauss-Ketel. Buru was visibly rattled, realizing the danger of his situation. Kang then ordered the guards to seize all disputed goods. The woman, heartbroken and desperate, accused Kang of stealing from the people just like the other corrupt nobles. Buru warned Kang that Shuz wouldn't stay quiet after this. Kang, now standing as the leader of the guards, retorted that any citizen who coerced or threatened a knight carrying out his duty was committing a crime. Buru, now nervous, backed down, saying that Kang would regret this decision. After a short time, the guards finished confiscating the goods. As Kang reviewed the seized items, he noticed something important. The woman's family had been food vendors. This explained why they had so much food stockpiled. An idea formed in Kang's mind. While it was cruel, he knew that these supplies could be used to feed the guards. Right now, the guards were the only force maintaining order in the city. If they deserted, Canadum would fall into total chaos. However, he also knew the public wouldn't see it this way. To them, the guards were now just another group of thieves. He checked the city's status and saw that public morale had dropped sharply. The number of optimistic citizens had fallen, but he had no choice. Survival came first. After dealing with the immediate crisis, Kang sought out Zyro, a key figure in Canadum's administration. Zyro had once been the city's vice lord, handling all administrative duties under Gauss. When Gauss fled, Zyro remained behind, keeping the city running despite impossible odds. Without him, Canadum would have collapsed immediately. Kang proposed a radical plan. They needed to seize all remaining food in the city under the pretext of war rationing. Zyro was horrified. He asked if Kang seriously wanted the guards to raid every home in the city and steal food from starving families. Kang explained that Buru had already started robbing food shops in Shuz's name. If they didn't act first, all the remaining food would vanish. Zyro sarcastically asked if Kang was suggesting that they needed to be faster thieves than Shuz. Kang corrected him. This wasn't about stealing, it was about preventing an even worse disaster. Zyro, still in shock, warned Kang that if he went through with this, he would be executed and his corpse torn apart. Kang, surprisingly calm, accepted this fate. He didn't care if he died. It would mean that the city had survived. This resolve shook Zyro. He could see that Kang was absolutely serious. Finally, Zyro relented, deciding to risk his life for Kessen's vision. Kang, grateful but resolute, acknowledged the weight of their decision. At that moment, the system notified him. Zyro had yielded to his coercion and accepted Kessen's leadership. Additionally, Zyro's unique skill, Bureaucrat, activated, granting a special buff, Comprehend the Situation. With his enhanced intelligence, Zyro immediately calculated the city's remaining food stores. Kang listened carefully. They needed to act fast. Their only chance of survival depended on what they did next. Kang notices that Zippo is now handling his work with the speed and precision of someone 20 years younger. Zippo hands Kang a detailed list of the shops and establishments in Canadum, including the Mercenary Guild, blacksmiths, and food merchants. At the end of the list, there is a record of the wealthiest families in the city. With this information, Kang could gather resources and recruit more soldiers. He warns Zippo that if this list falls into the wrong hands, it could be dangerous for him once everything is over. However, Zippo responds firmly, stating that they are in wartime and a specific administrator is necessary for survival. Kang reminds him that if they manage to survive, they will likely be hanged for their actions. Zippo, however, recalls that his parents lived there, as did he and his children. He says he cannot simply allow the Orcs to destroy his home, especially when an outsider is risking his life to protect it. Given this, Kang tells Zippo that if he is determined to hold on to this cause, he should sit by his side. However, Zippo responds that he is not at Kang's side, he is ahead of him. Then, he places an object on the table, the seal of Lord Gauss. Kang is taken aback and asks if this means what he thinks it does. Zippo confirms, saying that until Lord Gauss returns, Kang will be his representative and may act as he sees fit. The next morning, as soon as the sun rises, Kang gathers all the remaining soldiers in the Lord's manor. The total number was less than 300, and most of them were not well trained. The more experienced and capable soldiers had fled with Gauss, leaving behind only civilians recruited at the last minute, whose only qualification was being able to lift a spear. Kang displays a document signed by the Vice Lord and announces that he is now the General of Defense for Canadum. However, due to the poor education of the medieval era, few could read, meaning most of them did not understand the significance of the document. Even when he stated his new position, the soldiers appeared confused and uncertain. Faced with this, Kang takes a more aggressive and direct approach. He asks them if they want to die, activating his special coercion skill. He explains that if things continue as they are, Canadum has no future. They will either starve to death or lose the strength to resist and be torn apart by the Orcs. That is, in fact, the best-case scenario. Canadum is isolated, surrounded by enemies, without food, and with no hope of reinforcements. He then forces them to think about their own families and what will happen to them. Outraged, some soldiers start questioning whether the purpose of military training is to boost morale rather than instill fear. They ask if Kang expects everyone to flee the battle. Realizing he is on the right track, Kang responds with another question. What if there was another option? He first brings them to fear only to give them hope. Immediately after, he declares the general mobilization. He states that Zippo and Gauss agreed that Kang would be the leader of the guards and the general of defense. With that, he orders every man in the city who can hold a spear to enlist. All women should help by cooking for the soldiers. The elderly should pass down their knowledge, and blacksmiths should forge spears and bows. Canadum still has resources, and Kang intends to make full use of them. The soldiers hesitate, terrified at the idea of fighting the Orcs. However, Kang knows this is the moment to push them forward. He states that he will be called crazy and will likely die, but he will fight to save them. In his mind, he concludes that this is the classic method of motivation. Then, he asks the decisive question: who will join him? His special eloquence skill activates, amplifying the impact of his words. One of the guards steps forward, saying he will fight alongside him. The system issues an alert, informing him that his eloquence and coercion skills have been combined. Soon after, All the guards begin to repeat Kang's words. Their fear of death transforms into a desire to live, and they become true soldiers. Kang then gives the order to march. He leads from the front, with the guards following him faithfully. After some time, they arrive at a new location, the house of Orc Lord Gauss's brother. Buru stands in front of the residence and is shocked to see Kang leading the soldiers. He asks the reason for the visit, and Kang responds that he wants to live alongside them. In unison, the soldiers repeat the motto, striking their spears against the ground with precision. Buru, stunned by the scene, tries to argue with Kang. However, Kang declares that he is there to seize Shuz's supplies since, in times of war, all resources belong to the army. Furious, Buru draws his sword and points it at Kang's neck. He asks if Kang has gone mad and if he wishes to die. Without hesitation, Kang takes a step forward and challenges him. He tells Buru that if he wants, he can kill him, but he must be sure he can handle the 280 soldiers standing behind him afterward. Faced with the threat, Buru hesitates and steps back. He asks Kang why he is doing this. Kang places a hand on Buru's shoulder and states that if things continue as they are, everyone will die. He reminds Buru that Gauss fled with 500 soldiers, abandoning the rest. That is why Kang needs to gather resources, such as food, weapons, and wood, to ensure Canadum's survival. He argues that Shuz is only trying to take advantage of the situation and that Buru, deep down, knows it. Buru is conflicted. His childhood friend stands before him, leading an army and speaking with conviction. He realizes that if Kang is right, Canadum truly is on the brink of collapse. Buru finds himself torn between his loyalty to his master and the harsh reality of the situation. This is not just about defending the city from the orcs. It is about restoring hope to a place that had already resigned itself to destruction. Seeing the gradual transformation of Canadum, Kang realizes that leadership is not just about strength or strategy, but about instilling the will to fight in those who have lost it. He reflects on this. A messenger rushes toward him, breathless, carrying urgent news. Reports indicate that a group of scouts has spotted movement near the eastern gate, strange figures lurking beyond the hills, watching the city from the shadows. The guards stationed there claim that they have seen orcs gathering, but there is something different about these creatures. They are moving in a more coordinated manner than usual, their behavior resembling that of a trained military force rather than a disorderly horde. Kang immediately recognizes the implications. This is not just an ordinary group of orcs, this could be the army of the Orc Lord that Litra had mentioned earlier. If that is the case, then time is running out. The orcs might be waiting for the right moment to strike, and when they do, the city will not stand a chance if they are not fully prepared. Understanding the urgency of the situation, Kang orders all available scouts to be dispatched immediately. He instructs them to track the orc movements closely and gather as much intelligence as possible without being detected. They need to determine the exact size of the enemy force, its composition, and whether there are any vulnerabilities that can be exploited. As the scouts set out, Kang returns to the city's defenses. The past few days have been about gathering resources and rallying the people, but now the focus must shift entirely to war preparations. He oversees the distribution of weapons, ensuring that even those with no combat experience are given something to defend themselves. Every man, woman, and even older children who are strong enough to lift a weapon must be prepared for what is coming. At the same time, he meets with Litra and Zero to discuss the potential use of the teleportation scroll. The goal remains the same, to send someone to the nearest allied city and request reinforcements. But there is still one major obstacle: the presence of the orc army surrounding Canadum. If they attempt to teleport directly to the city of Herdale without a proper plan, they risk being intercepted or revealing their desperate situation to potential allies, which could weaken their negotiating position. Litra suggests a bold idea: sending an elite team through the enemy's perimeter under the cover of night, moving silently and avoiding unnecessary confrontations. If they can breach the orc encirclement and escape undetected, they will be able to use the scroll safely from a secure location. Kang agrees with the plan but emphasizes that it will require their best warriors, those who are both skilled in combat and experienced in moving unseen. As they finalize the plan, another troubling report arrives. A group of citizens has started questioning Kang's leadership, demanding answers about why he has confiscated resources from the wealthiest families and redistributed them to the soldiers. They argue that he is no different from the corrupt lords who abandoned them, and some are even accusing him of planning to rule the city for himself. Kang knows this is a dangerous situation. Morale is fragile, and dissent, if left unchecked, could spread quickly. He decides to address the citizens directly, gathering them in the city square. With his coercion ability still active, he speaks with authority, reminding them of the reality they face. He does not sugarcoat the situation. He acknowledges that he took resources from the rich, but he did so to ensure that the city has a fighting chance. Without soldiers, without weapons, without food, they would all be dead within days at first. The crowd remains restless, but as Kang speaks, something shifts. His words strike a chord with those who had lost all hope, and gradually, their resistance softens. By the end of his speech, there are murmurs of understanding rather than outright hostility. He knows that not everyone will support him, but for now, he has bought enough time to continue his mission without civil unrest tearing the city apart from within. As the night falls, the scouts return with their reports. The Orc army is massive, far larger than they initially feared. But there is one crucial detail that stands out. The Orcs appear to be preparing siege equipment, something that they do not usually employ. This confirms Kang's suspicions. The Orc Lord is not just another war chief. He is a strategist, planning to take Canadum by force rather than relying solely on brute strength. Realizing that the city's defenses might not hold against a prolonged siege, Kang decides to accelerate their plan. The elite team will leave at dawn, attempting to break through the enemy lines before the Orcs fully mobilize. If they fail, Canadum will have no choice but to stand alone against an overwhelming force as Kang prepares for what may be the most critical battle of his life. He cannot help but reflect on how much things have changed since he first arrived in this world. He came here as an outsider, stepping into the shoes of a man who had been pushed to the brink. Now, he is not just surviving, he is leading, making decisions that will determine the fate of an entire city. But there is no time for self-reflection. The battle for Canadum is about to begin, and Kang knows that failure is not an option.